Everything working okay?
Okay.
Is the sound working? Question mark.
So there are people watching already. How did they get the link?
I it shows up in my YouTube thing. It shows a premiering thing. It's going to a video is going to premiere in this amount of time, and so they just sit there and wait, and it pops up when and they're already in it. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah, it seems like we have like six people in right now.
Cool. What's up, people?
So just waiting for them to respond about the sound. Because I think there's like I think it's a
Okay.
15-second delay where this whatever we happen takes 15 seconds to get to them, and then for them to send something back to me or something. I think I've timed that. All right, we got it back. Says sound is good. So Professor Brown, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your YouTube channel before we get started?
Cool. Yeah, totally. Feel free to call me Richard, by the way, if you're comfortable with that. So yeah, my name's Richard Brown. I'm a professor at the City University of New York, where I teach philosophy and psychology and neuroscience. And I'm very interested in the interrelation of the brain and the mind. And I thank you for mentioning I do have a YouTube channel. You can find it. It's called Consciousness Online. And I have a lot of my lectures for my classes there, but also videos. I hosted an online conference called the Online Consciousness Conference for a few years. I have videos from there. And then also I have a kind of a podcast discussion series where I talk to people about consciousness, scientists, philosophers, musicians, hippies, whoever, anyone's interested in consciousness is welcome to come and talk to me about that. So, and also occasionally I react. I have a reaction channel as well where I listen to death metal and react to old school 90s death metal. And I've been updating that lately to see what's been going on in the recent period. So I do that under the name X Metalhead.
Awesome. Yeah, I saw your debate with Philip Goff and Bernardo Castro. That was extremely interesting.
Oh, cool. Thanks. Yeah.
So yeah, so I
Two very different worldviews there, I would say. I'd say they were debating. I mean, yeah, I think of the stuff that I do more as having discussions than as having debates. But definitely those guys coming from totally different places. I know you had a discussion with Bernardo too, right?
yep, and I have one planned with Philip next month.
Oh, awesome. Okay,
So
cool.
yeah, I've been really interested in the same topic of consciousness as you have, though I take the materialistic viewpoint. I don't understand quite what the idealistic or dualistic position is really saying, especially this idea that consciousness is fundamental. I don't really understand what that means exactly. What is your take on the issue?
Well, my take on the materialist dualism stuff. Uh, Probably my strongest commitment is to the identity theory, the mind-brain identity theory. So I tend to be a pretty simplistic guy. I tend my official position is one of like we don't know and the shit's hard, but I tend to the position I would actually like defend is that materialism has not been refuted by a priori conceptual arguments or by any kind of. So I don't think idealism or dualism have been established. I don't think physicalism has been defeated, but I don't think physicalism has been established either. I think it's idealism is a viable possibility, and same with dualism. I take it seriously with respect to like people like Philip who are panpsychists. I think that those that kind of view, especially the view that he defends, is worth attention simply because for me, I mean, the reason why I'm most committed to physicalism is because of thinking about how the mind and the body interact and thinking about mental causation and that kind of stuff. So to me, it just seems bizarre to deny that the mind and the body interact. And dualism, it's harder to make sense of that, not impossible, but harder. But panpsychism at least allows you a way to try to make sense of that idea. And so I think it's worth taking seriously just for that reason. But generally, I tend to, well, I wouldn't say that I like believe physicalism is true. I do think it's the most plausible view and that it's not threatened by any of the kinds of arguments that we see hanging around lately. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that I definitely find it really interesting, the a priori arguments, but I'm not sure exactly how they work. Because from my perspective, to say that consciousness is fundamental is even more mysterious than to say consciousness is a product of some combination of physical things. Like, even though we have no idea what kind of physical combination could produce consciousness, we have equally no idea what it would mean for something to be fundamental. Like, we don't have some kind of fundamental detector in the universe. Science can't tell us anything about the fundamental. Logic can't really tell us anything about the fundamental. So to say that it's fundamental would be like to say consciousness is made of lots of green pixies or something. It's such an abstract concept. I don't know how that could really qualify as evidenced position as opposed to physicalism, because at least we know physical stuff exists in some respect.
Right. Yeah. So I think that, I mean, so I don't know. I go back and forth. One thing that we can say is, I think you agree with me on this, that we know we're conscious. And I'm not, so this may be something that we can talk about later, but I'm not really a big fan of knowledge claims or epistemology generally. In fact, I'm more interested in having true beliefs than in justified true beliefs. So I think that's sometimes in epistemology what's called the swamping problem, which is, what does knowing something add over and above simply having a true belief. So I think the true beliefs are important, and knowledge, maybe not, who knows. I like your approach. I like fallibilism. Definitely, I think that's an improvement on traditional views about knowledge. But anyway, so one thing that so the reason I said that is because while I don't like knowledge claims generally, I think one thing that we can be fairly certain that we know is that we're conscious. We have conscious experience.
Fairly certain?
I think that fairly certain. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that eliminativism and illusionism are views that should be taken seriously. And on those views, I argue with my friends all the time about this, but some people believe that, you could be wrong, that you're conscious right now and that you could be a zombie. And, the mere possibility that you could have, that zombies could exist entails somehow that you don't know you're a zombie right now. So in fact, my old podcast I had called Space Time Mind that I did with Pete Mandic, half the podcast was like us beating the shit out of each other over this exact topic. Like, you don't know you're a zombie. I was like, yes, I fucking do. He's like, no, you fucking don't. It's like 70 hours of that. So anyway, so I think we can be fairly confident that we're conscious. It's the thing I put a lot of faith in. And I find it odd. So I take that as bedrock. And I find it really odd when people like just don't see how that could be physical. In fact, I've spent some time thinking, so the a priori arguments against physicalism, I've developed one against dualism. So here it goes. I can conceive that consciousness is physical. So therefore it's possible. So therefore, fuck you. And basically at that point, it becomes clear, I think, that really what we have here is simply a class of intuitions. So it's like people like Bernardo and Philip, they just can't understand from their point of view how the mind could be physical. And I say, well, I don't think it's that difficult to understand. It's, something we might discover about the world. And so, there's no contradiction in the idea. If there were, show it to me. Like, please wheel it out. I'd love to see the contradiction. So I think that these guys, they overestimate I mean, I don't want to be mean because I like these guys, are my friends, but I think that they tend to put too much faith in their rational abilities. I think that people who are, tend to be good at math and to have quick intuitive judgments about which things are correct and to overestimate how good they are in other areas. And so, I just don't really see much reason to think of consciousness as fundamental. However, having said all of that, I do think that the way that people like Philip will argue is as follows. So what they'll say is, look, we know that we're conscious. And we have some reason, I don't know if it's good reason or not, but we have some reason for thinking that consciousness is like an intrinsic property, that it is what it is in and of itself, not in relation to other things. So like the experience of pain, the experience of red or something like that. There's something about it that seems simple. It seems intrinsic. So we have that. And if you really can't see how to fit that into the physical world, if you really think there's this, explanatory gap, a hard problem, whatever you want to call it, that you can't understand how qualities could ever be identical to something quantitative, then I think it's at that point, they feel free to go and explore their other things. But I mean, when they say consciousness is fundamental, all they really mean is that, well, first of all, when we talk about consciousness, what we mean is that there's something that it's like for us, what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, as opposed to simply being aware or being awake or whatever. To have that to be fundamental would simply mean that it is what it is independently of any of the physical stuff that's going on. So I don't think that's too difficult to understand. I just don't see the motivation for thinking it's true. I mean, that's my position on it anyway.
Yeah, I can totally relate to some of his arguments. Like some of his arguments say that it's impossible to describe consciousness with just physical terms, which I kind of agree with. I think that's true. Just like I think it's impossible to describe the true essence of matter with scientific terms. science describes interactions between things, but it doesn't have like, there's not like a scientific equation for an ontology. It's not like there's not like a wood term in science. It's just saying, well, there are these particles and they interact with these other particles in this way, and we call that wood. So even if there
Right.
was some fundamental ontology to science, to matter in the universe, science wouldn't be able to tell you what it is. It would just tell you, well, here's how it interacts with the other stuff. And so there's no way in science to give us a complete description of what the fundamental nature of reality is. And the same thing would be true of neurology. There's no way for it to give us a complete description of conscious experience or quality experience for the exact same reason. And it's just the distinction between the map and the territory. The map could never give you a perfect distinction of the territory. And so I definitely
Right.
see that he can use that as an argument to try and say, well, here's one thing that can never be done in physicalist descriptions of consciousness, which I totally agree with. But I don't see that as a problem with the ontology of physicalism. I just see it as a problem with the epistemology, that the map and the territory, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, these are deep waters here, obviously, and so a lot of this depends on your background views about all of this stuff. So, the arguments against physicalism. I mean, I think it's kind of notable that the arguments against physicalism are all conceptual or a priori, and that there are no real good empirical arguments. I'm not even sure what that would mean, but anyway, so. Some people take what's conceivable or what's epistemically possible to be a good guide for what's actually metaphysically possible, like what really could be the case. And so there's a link between those two that a lot of people think is intuitive. And in my darker moments, I also think maybe that there's an intuitive link between what's conceivable and what's possible. And by conceivable, I mean that you can kind of there's no contradiction entailed by it. I don't mean like it's imaginable or you can picture it in your mind, but I just mean like you can't detect a contradiction. And so it does seem to me that at least occasionally that if something is coherent, logically coherent, then probably it's a possible way that the world could be. And if that's the case, then you can see the link between the sort of epistemic claims and the metaphysical claims. So on the one hand, if it's possibly the way that this world could have been, so I guess to be real technical, you got to distinguish between saying repeating myself, the way the world could have been and the way the world could be. So one is an epistemic notion, and one is a metaphysic notion. So, if I say, for all I know, that could be like this, that's different than saying the world could have been such and such. So could the world have been such that water was not H2O? No, water is H2O. It always was H2O. It was H2O when Aristotle said all the stupid things that he said about it, that it was a simple and didn't have parts and everything like that. And it was just H2O. So you're out of luck, Aristotle, big deal. So if it really could have been the case that consciousness didn't exist, but yet we had all the physical stuff here, if that's really conceivably possible, if it really is the world, if the world really could have been that way, then I think that does put pressure on the claim that physicalism is true. At least if you interpret physicalism as being the claim that that there's kind of an entailment relationship between the physical facts and the consciousness facts, which is, not everyone endorses that view, but I tend to think if you don't endorse that view, you have to say what physicalism means. And if it becomes really hard to even give a definition of it unless you have some way of cashing that out. For instance, if you just say, well, physicalism is true just if there's physical stuff at the world and there's consciousness, well, there might also be non-physical things that are somehow sneaking into the picture. So if there's not this entailment relationship, I think you run into problems right there. And if that's the case, then the epistemic stuff does become important. And where I would push back on that is by saying, we don't really know epistemically what we can conceive at this point. So I don't know, David Chalmers invented the concept zombies, physical duplicates of me that lack consciousness. I invented the concept of a Shambi. That's a physical duplicate of me that has consciousness. Neither of those seem to me to be contradictory. So who's doing the conceiving in the right way, him or me? I don't know. It seems to me that just like with the case of water, we could conceive that water was an H2O, or we thought we could when Aristotle was around. It turns out we couldn't actually, because it just happened to be actually H2O. So anyway, so I do think the epistemic stuff matters. But on the other hand, there are people who are physicalists, the so-called type B physicalists, who say, no. You can conceive it. That doesn't mean it's really possible, because they want to sever the link between what's conceivable and what's possible. And I think that's a coherent position as well. And, on my less darker days, I tend to think, why are we so confident why us little creatures around here are so confident that we have some access to the way things have to be. Like, who the fuck are we? Doesn't make any sense. But on the other hand, sometimes I think, no, actually, we're pretty smart. And sometimes we can figure out what's going on. So I don't know. But I think both positions lend themselves to physicalism having a way out of these conundrums.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I think that's the ancient debate between rationalism versus empiricism. Can we conceive of it? That must be evidence because we thought of it, therefore that's true knowledge. And empiricism is like, no, we can think of a lot of stuff, but we're dumb. We're dumb monkeys.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah,
you get
exactly.
like quantum mechanics where I forget, it was Quine who said that we can doubt even the law of excluded middle. It's been used to figure out stuff in quantum mechanics. So our conceivability is kind of out the window at this point on that end. So but yeah,
Well, I guess I'd be a little bit careful about that point, though.
which one?
About the quantum mechanic points. I don't think we've thrown the law of excluded middle out. I don't think quantum mechanics in any way challenges. There was actually a philosopher named Hilary Putnam who wrote a paper on this. It talked about quantum logic and stuff like that. I think that's been kind of debunked as far as I understand it. Quantum mechanics uses regular logic. It's just linear algebra. And there's nowhere in anything of the formalisms of quantum mechanics, nothing in the mathematics that says that something is and isn't a certain way. What it says is not classic. It's not a classical state that you have to accept, but you certainly don't have to accept that it is and isn't a particle or what something like that. So it just means there's some non-classical state of the system may be perfectly well susceptible to be governing by the law of non-contradiction.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Quantum mechanics doesn't tell us about ontology because physics really can't do that. But Quine just used that in the quote in one of his papers. I think it was one of the ones related to the two dogmas of empiricism, where he just explicitly said we can even doubt, like, all of a priori knowledge is doubtable, even the law of excluded middle. And he used quantum mechanics as an example. I don't know if that would be right or not. I definitely know it's possible, and there's quantum logic has been invented to try and describe that, but which one is actually right is kind of up in the air, and we don't know about quantum mechanics enough to know which interpretation is correct or not. So
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah. So this is something that I guess we're getting a little bit off track here, but if you're all right with it, I'm all right with it. So what I would want to say about that is, I guess I'd want to draw a distinction between, like, what we would say alogic and logic. So alogic is a language, which is obviously man-made, and there are different kinds of logic, like relevance logic, intuition logic, you name it, free logic, fuzzy logic, right? Exactly. So many-valued logic. But logic is so that's alogic, right? So that's little l. But logic, so first of all, there's reasoning. We reason, and we reason intuitively. Like, before we ever write down any formal systems, before Aristotle ever thought of, syllogistic logic, before any of that, people were reasoning. And what we want to do is try to describe the way that we reason. And we want to describe when we reason well. And so, I guess this is, in the background, I'm smuggling in something, because there are two different ways you might think about logic. One, you might think, well, it describes the world. Another way you might say, no, it describes, like, this abstract thing called logical consequence. And another way you might say is, no, it describes what we do when we reason. And so, I mean, I don't know. So there's a whole big problem around whether we can just pick any logic we want and start running with it. It's called the adoption problem, starting from the work of Saul Kripke. Basically, his idea is that you can't adopt a logic because, for example, take a rule. His famous one is the universal instantiation. Suppose that there was someone who could never use the rule of instantiation. So they say, all ravens are black. And then they say, oh, I accept that, but I don't know why I should believe this raven is black. Well, in order to understand that all ravens are black entails that this raven is black, you have to already be able to use universal instantiation. You already have to know that every universal sentence entails all its instances. And so what that seems to suggest is that logic is special in the sense that you can't just pick any logic you want and start reasoning with it, because there's a kind of intuitive sense of reasoning that we already have to be able to reason to use the logic in the first place, which maybe shows that there's something anti-Quinean, because you brought up Quine. Maybe it shows that logic isn't just like a theory, which you can, like a theory of physics, which you could pick up and run with. So maybe there is something like what we might want to call the correct logic or something like that. So I don't know. These are deep issues, but so I guess I would say, yeah, it is a little bit. I mean, it's related to, I don't know if you know, probably you do, but the what the tortoise said to Achilles, the sort of Lewis Carroll
Zeno paradox.
Argument. It's not exactly that. So Lewis Carroll wrote this paper called What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, where they're arguing about whether, so the tortoise says, hey, you, buddy over there, force me to accept something logically. Like, I won't ever do it. And so you say if P, then Q, and also P, and I say, to hell with it, I don't accept Q. So force me to accept Q just on the basis of logic. And so Achilles says, sure, all you have to do is add another premise. What the premise says is if you have if P, then Q, and also P, then Q follows. And the tortoise says, yeah, that's just another conditional statement. I don't accept that. I don't see why I should accept that. If I have P, then Q, and also P, then I should accept Q. Well, Achilles says, just add another conditional statement. Well, if you have if P, then Q, and also if you know that if P, then Q, and Q, then P, and you just kind of go off on a regress so that there's no real way you could ever justify why we accept a logical rule like modus ponens as being valid. And so, yeah, it's related to that in the sense that it seems like, so it's not exactly Zeno's paradox, but it's basically saying that deductive logic in and of itself seems to require more than simply saying it's arbitrary and that we can make it up any way that we want, because in order to even evaluate those alternative systems, we already have to be able to use some sort of sense of reasoning.
Yeah, I think I would totally agree, but I think that's determined by just how our brains formed in reality. I think that, for example, we can't imagine a round square because it's something that doesn't correspond to reality. Our brains are in reality, and they, in some respect, reflect reality. And so the logic that we use would have to also reflect that part of reality as well. So reality cannot not be reality. Therefore, some part of our brain, whichever part developed, can't actually give us false beliefs in that respect. And so we are limited in the logics we can use because they have to reflect reality in some sense. And whichever parts do reflect reality seem to be those parts that we can't pick and choose and get rid of in logic. So I definitely think logic is reflective of reality in that sense, to pick one of the three options you proposed. But I don't think it's because logic itself is somehow special. I just think it's just a language that describes reality, and some versions do and some versions don't. And if you pick the versions that don't, well, then you're going to get something that you can't imagine, like a round square anyway, and you're not even capable of doing that, which is why we can come to the conclusion that there are some right logics, because they're the ones that reflect reality.
Yeah, but then you've just pushed the mystery back onto reality.
How so?
Well, because the question is, why is reality that way? So why can't it be and not to be at the same time? So if we have a, by the way, I think I can imagine square circles, by the way, in non-Euclidean geometries. It's perfectly acceptable to have things like that, I would say. But, it's an assumption that we have that reality is Euclidean. It seems to me to be false, given Einstein's theories and so forth. And, there could imagine all sorts of ways that reality could be geometrically situated with respect, but logic seems to be different, because I can pick any. So the comparison with geometry, I think, is a good comparison, because I could pick any geometry I want and start thinking about it. I say, okay, so here's one where space is looks like a saddle. It's curved and it goes, and here's one where it's really concave, and here's one and you start reasoning what would be true under those circumstances. But it doesn't seem like we can do that with logic. So it seems like we can do that with arbitrary mathematical systems, but not with logic. And it seems like reality can vary sort of independently along those lines as well. So, anyway, so I think that there's a different, I do think that it's hard to deny that there's a difference between the way that we think about logic and the way that we think about, someone's asking how I can imagine a square circle. It's non-Euclidean geometry. That's the answer. It's like saying this. So I don't know, there's a technical question here, which is, in a non-Euclidean world, are there any straight lines? Well, if you define a straight line as the shortest distance between 2 points, then yes, that thing which is curved is a straight line. And so I think that there's no problem in saying that that is a straight line in a non-Euclidean way. But so I think that logic is different and doesn't depend on reality in the way that you're suggesting. I think it depends on the way, describing the way we think about reality, the laws of thought, so to speak.
Oh yeah, I totally agree that on non-Euclidean geometry, you can definitely imagine a round square. In taxicab math, you can imagine some really strange things in mathematics as well. But just given, like, if you, using a Euclidean geometry, can you imagine a round square? Then I think that's where you would get the problem I was trying to illustrate, is that in that kind of a framework, it's impossible, because that's where you get into the contradictions with the way reality is that I would describe. And
but the question is then, which one maps onto reality?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I
So,
think
so Euclidean space doesn't map onto reality,
right. So I mean
right?
that was just hypothetical to get to the most basic point. So it wasn't saying that Euclidean space itself maps onto reality. It's just the comparison between trying using Euclidean space and then trying to imagine a round square. That basic relation is what maps on to reality, not the Euclidean space part. So the comparison there is the if you take Euclidean space and then you try to imagine a round square, it becomes impossible. And the reason it becomes impossible is because there's something about a relation in a Euclidean space that doesn't allow those things. Because
Right,
and that relation is what maps onto reality.
right.
But then I definitely understand your point that just pushes the question back onto reality because it leads to a Grippus trilemma. Is it an infinite regress of some kind? Does it cause itself? Is it just some foundational fact that we just have to just assert as a brute fact? And that's huge problem that I don't know how to solve that problem.
Yeah, no one knows how to solve that. Exactly.
I'm in
So,
good
so
company.
yeah, exactly. So, but that the only reason I brought all this up is because you were saying um, that that reality itself is enough to sort of ground logic or something like that, and I'm not sure that that actually follows unless we sort of know the nature of reality or something. So, but even so, I think that if reality could vary and logic would stay the same, and that's simply that sort of counts against that point, I guess I'd say.
Oh yeah, I definitely find it's possible that there could be like a platonic kind of logical object that precedes reality, and then reality flows from that. But I see the same thing as with consciousness, is that it could be the other way too. I think that reality could exist as a brute fact of some kind, and then logic flows from that just as easily. So I don't think it's just like there's one way that's absolutely correct, but I definitely think you can ground logic in just essentially your experience of reality without any need to invoke a kind of platonic logic out there.
Yeah. So I mean, it depends on what you mean by ground logic. So you mean what are the truth makers for logic? What makes it true that like the law of the excluded middle or something like that? Um, yeah. So I guess I would be kind of I don't know. So let me just say, yeah, for this, I'll take for now. Let's just grant the point because I guess I'm more open to it with respect to math because I think that of mathematical truths as kind of empirical generalizations. So I guess why couldn't logical truths be empirical generalizations of a certain sort? I'm not sure what. Yeah, I forget why we started down this rabbit hole or how it relates to consciousness. But
I think you said how does because I said reality can't not be reality, and you said you could
yeah,
imagine a way it could. I found
right.
that interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends on what you mean by reality. So, what do you mean by reality?
All
Like just
existing
the stuff out
things,
there,
yeah,
all the existing
all
things.
existing things.
What are the existing things?
I don't know how to answer that. Just everything that I don't know a word other than exists to describe that.
Yeah. Um, so the things which have being or something like that, maybe. So if you really take seriously the kind of line that you were pushing earlier, no, Siri, I'm not talking to you. Fuck off. Every time I say an S word, Siri pops up. Did you mean me? It's like, no, I said seriously, not Siri. Okay. Oops. Fuck you. All right. Sorry. I did it again. Okay. So if you really take seriously the line that you were pushing about quantum mechanics, then the view that you're pushing here really holds logic hostage to the way the world turns out to be. So, if can reality be and not be? Well, I don't see why it couldn't. Is there a possible world where reality is and isn't? Well, yeah, they're called contradictory worlds. They're well explored mathematically. We understand them. There are possible worlds where contradictions are true. Maybe they're isolated from the rest of modal space. Who knows? That's a deep question about modal logic. No one gives a shit. But it's like, okay, is that a way of reality being other than reality? I don't know. If it is and isn't at the same time, then isn't that a way of not being it?
Well, I'd say in a pair consistent logic, I wouldn't see that as a problem. So if you imagine a world where there's a non-standard logic where something can be and not be at the same time, but that doesn't isn't like explosive and apply to everything in the universe, then that would be a way to say that reality is reality, and there is a non-standard logic in that reality. And I believe that would be perfectly consistent. But if it applied explosively and reality itself was and was not, then I would say that would probably not be consistent.
Well, who cares about consistency?
Just the way we
I
think
mean,
about stuff.
Gödel's proof sort of already suggests that probably we're not consistent.
Which one? Because I remember like
The
Gödel's
incompleteness proof.
the second one I think states that no system can be shown to be independently consistent without reference to an external system of some kind. I believe that's the second one, but it doesn't actually show it is inconsistent. It just shows it can't be shown to be consistent.
That's right. So, yeah, but so we have no reason to believe that our reasoning system is consistent, I guess, is sort of the lesson that I would take from that. I mean, so consistency, who gives a shit?
I take that as just an epistemic question. Like, well, we can't know that science. We can't know we're not a brain in a vat. You kind of take it like the exact same way. Like, yeah, you're technically right about that, but I'm gonna go with the induction here. We're just gonna grant it and move on.
Do you really think you can't know that you're a brain in a vat?
Well, if I go with the fallibilistic system, I can know in that sense, but not with absolute certainty. I don't think there's an infallible way to know we're not a brain in a vat, and that's usually what people mean.
Yeah, I don't think there's an infallible way to know anything, but I certainly think that it's a safe bet to say that we're not in a brain of vat, and I don't think we need absolute certainty to rule that out. But you know about Putnam's sort of famous proof that we're not in a brain in the vat.
Was that the one? I
Um,
have hands. If I have
yeah,
hands, I'm not in the matrix, or I'm not a brain in the vat. Therefore, I'm not in the brain in the vat.
yeah, pretty much.
That was really hilarious.
Yeah, well, it's. I mean, that's like a version of the way that Moore would put it. But basically, the idea is that the word that we use for hand refers to this thing. So we can't even talk about the stuff which is outside of the vats. But I mean, I don't know. I have good friends of mine who say that there's like a 25% chance that we're in a simulation right now. They take the simulation argument hypothesis very seriously.
The Nick Bostrom
Uh,
one that there's more
yeah.
simulated worlds than real worlds, so it's more likely we're in one of the simulated ones.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that there's one of three possibilities that is happening. So one, either we kill ourselves, or two, we stop simulating things, or eventually there will be more simulated beings than real beings, than non-simulated ones. So the chances are that we are amongst the simulated class. I think that's, it doesn't prove that we are in any way, obviously, but it certainly does open up the hypothesis. I think to be able to get there, you have to answer this question that was asked in the chat, which
Which
is whether
one?
consciousness is computational or not. There, I mean, I'm a skeptic about functionalism, computationalism in general. Doesn't mean I think it's false, but I do wish it were true that consciousness was biological in some sense. That's why I started out sort of talking about the identity theory, my brain identity theory. On if that were true, then consciousness wouldn't be computational. And if that were the case, then you couldn't simulate a conscious mind. And if that's the case, then I can know I'm not a brain in the vat or and otherwise in the matrix or some other kind of simulated scenario.
Well, how would that follow? Because even if we grant that consciousness is biological in some way, if you had a sufficiently complicated computer to be able to simulate all of the biological interactions, you would be able to produce something like consciousness.
Why?
Well, if it's just a physical interaction and you can replicate the physical interactions with a different medium, like I can build a chair out of wood or I can build it out of metal, you get the chair either way. So if consciousness
But
is,
can you build gold out of non-gold?
no.
Yeah, so it might be like gold, unless like chairs.
I guess I could understand that. Oh, but you said something earlier. What you get into debates about can we know that we exist? Like, are we conscious? And I think we
Yeah.
can. I think we do have absolute certainty about that because you also said we don't have absolute certainty about anything. I think the
Yes.
cogito does give us absolute certainty that we exist. And that's I don't know how I could think I exist and be wrong. To use Barry Stroud's quote, it's not possible.
Uh-huh. Let me try this on you. So when I was an undergraduate and I first read Descartes, I was very convinced. I was kind of a closet dualist at that point in my life. I was a scrawny asthmatic kid who was interested in math a lot. And so I was like, fuck this body. I can't be this body. And it was kind of really humiliating for me to finally come to terms with it. Geez, I guess I am a fucking body, like a meat. It's crazy. Anyway, okay. So it seems to me very intuitively clear that like I'm having experience right now, and that there's no way that I could doubt that. But of course, a zombie would say the same thing. A zombie would say, "There's no way that I could." A zombie, a philosophical zombie, which is a duplicate that lacks consciousness. Not the cool zombies, like in The Last of Us 2, which just won Game of the Year. By the way, a segue. Do you approve of that happening, or are you against that?
Against what?
The Last of Us 2 winning Game of the Year.
I don't know. Haven't really played many video games this year. I mean, if it was up against The Witcher, I'd say no, Witcher should win. Or
Mhm.
Cyberpunk 77, I'm thinking is probably going to win. So I don't really know if there's a lot of really good games that came out this year to really compete with it. So I don't think I have an issue as far as I can tell.
Okay.
Sekiro was really good. That one probably could have won, but it's more of a niche game. Same with Dark Souls. I don't know if those are really contenders
Yeah,
for Game
Dark
of the
Souls. I
Years
love Dark Souls.
for sure.
Um, Bloodborne is one of my all-time favorite games. But I just finished playing The Last of Us 2 on New Game Plus, and I liked it better the second time. I was a little bit. Anyway, I don't want to derail this to talk about that, but I was just playing before we start talking, so it's fresh in my mind. But okay, so how could you not know that you're a zombie? All right, so when I first read the card, I felt it was very intuitively certain. But then when I was thinking about it, I started wondering the following things. So suppose that you buy this Descartes argument about the evil genius and all that shit. So maybe we're being deceived right now. So what if the evil genius has multiple personality disorder? What if he has dissociative identity disorder, and what I am is simply an alter of the evil genius? If that's the case, then I don't really exist in the way that I think that I do. I'm not a separate individual with conscious experience of my own. And if that's a coherent possibility, then I think it does put pressure, at least on this kind of intuitive certainty that we have about whether we exist in the way that we think we do. That's the first plank of the kind of argument. So what do you think about that?
Oh, I fully agree. I don't claim to know that I exist in any particular way, but I do know that I exist. So even if I am a multiple personality of the evil demon, then I exist. I'm the evil demon, or one of the personalities of the evil demon.
Right.
And so simply by I exist, I simply mean just the thinking. I am the thinking, there is thinking occurring, the thinking exists. Whatever that is, that thing exists.
What do you think about thinking? What do you mean by thinking?
Just quality experience, conscious experience, any thought, any experience of
Okay.
anything.
Yeah. Okay. So really, that's what people after Descartes said that he should have said. What he should have said is there is thinking, so therefore there is existence. Like something exists, and not that I exist. I think so that's what I was kind of questioning was the bit that you built the I in. That we have this intuitive sense that we exist as an agent or as a self, or that there's something that is me. Certainly, Descartes thought that the mind was a simple, undivisible object, and I had access to that in a sort of an infallible way. So it sounds like you don't agree with that
No,
bit of it.
I'm not a Cartesian dualist. I think that has been very well debunked. I definitely like Bertrand Russell's critique of what is the I in that argument, showing it doesn't tell us anything about the ontology of the I. For
Yeah.
sure, I
Okay.
totally agree. But it does, I do agree with like Kierkegaard's understanding of cogito, which is just the thinking and the I are synonymous. They're the same thing. So whatever that thinking is, that's what I mean by I. Whatever that is, I don't know what it is, but those are the same thing.
Okay. So and now here's another. So building off, so that you agree with me on that. So here's another second step that you might take. So there are some times where we're having experiences and we're mistaken about the experience that we're having. You agree with that?
Sure, delusions, hallucinations, misconceptions.
No, not. Well, that's not exactly what I mean, because in those kinds of cases, you're not mistaken about the experience you're having. You're mistaken about the content of it, or what is representing, or what is putting you in touch with in the world. But if I have an experience, if I have an hallucination, I mean, when I was in college, my roommate took a bunch of mushrooms and chased Snuffleupagus down the hallway. And so, he was experiencing Snuffleupagus running down the hallway. In fact, we found him in the bathroom, like trying to go down the toilet to find fucking Snuffy. And we were pulling him away. He was like, "No, Snuffy, I gotta find him." We're like, "No, dude, he's not down there." So he was not mistaken about what he was experiencing. He was mistaken about whether fucking Snuffy was in the bathroom. But he certainly wasn't. We couldn't come to him and say, "No, you're wrong. You weren't experiencing that big hairy elephant thing." He was having that experience.
So what do you
So
mean
I,
by
so,
confusion about our experiences?
um, well, so here's an example, I guess. So one that let's see, a couple of examples. So one, my wife really likes blue cheese dressing, and I really like ranch dressing, and we have both of them in the house. And occasionally, I'll get a salad and take a bite of it and be like, "Ugh, this fucking sucks, dude. This ranch dressing is bad." And then she says to me, "Oh no, that's the blue cheese dressing." And then I say, "Oh, actually, it's quite good." So there, because I was expecting the taste of ranch dressing, I sort of was. I mean, I had that taste in my mouth, or in my experience. I don't know where it is, but I was having that taste, and nothing changed about the taste. but it seems like I was mistaken about what I was experiencing in that case. It seems like what I was experiencing was a rotten, sour, disgusting ranch dressing, when really what I was tasting was
Is that the kind your wife likes?
delicious blue cheese.
The rotten, sour, disgusting ranch dressing. That's the one she uses.
Yes. No, she used blue cheese, but what it tasted like to me was rotten, sour, disgusting ranch dressing.
Well, yeah,
So
my response to that would be I don't think that's a misconception about the experience. I think you really did have the taste of ranch dressing because of psychological priming. You can have your brain, the neuroplasticity of your brain lights up when you imagine something in the exact same way it lights up when you're actually experiencing the thing, just to a lesser degree. And
right.
those priming sensations can cause you to have those other sensation of ranch dressing, even though you're eating blue cheese, because the psychological priming is there. So I wouldn't say you were actually mistaken about your experience there. I think you were correct about your experience. You were just wrong about the snuffleupagus part.
But then why does it, so excuse me, what changes about it when I recognize that it's good? So it seems to me like the same taste is there. It's the same
Yep.
taste. Nothing has changed about it. So it just seems like I was wrong about the way it tasted.
Well, I'd say it was the neuroplastic interactions in your brain are what changed, and so the priming in your brain caused more of the patterns related to ranch dressing to be activated, and that caused you to have the sensation of ranch dressing. Just like when we know that you can simulate smells or simulate pain when you imagine, like when you're dreaming, you can feel pain that you actually experiencing, even though there was no pain there. It's just you
Right.
had this recollection of what it was like to have pain, and that activated in your brain and caused you to have the same sensation as if you were having pain. And so I think that was happening in the brain. And so the only thing that changed was the chemical interactions in your brain associated more to the blue cheese than to the ranch, and that caused the flavor to change at the same time.
But it doesn't seem like it changed to me.
What do you mean? I thought you said it did.
The taste was the same in before and after. Nothing changed in the experience, just in the way I assessed it. So I was like, this taste equals bad ranch dressing taste. And then seconds later, I was like, this taste equals good blue cheese taste. And the taste was the same in both throughout. It was the same taste. I don't know. Maybe you would describe a difference, but
Well, I'd say there's
differently.
two possibilities there, because I've experienced it both ways, where I have one taste or one experience that is something bad for me, and then I can literally have a completely different experience just by changing the way I think about it. And it's like, oh, there's a completely different neurological structure there, a different smell, a different taste, whatever. And then there's the other possibility would be you have the exact same experience and you say this is bad, and then you just change, think, oh, actually it's good. And so
Right.
in that case, you haven't experienced anything differently. Nothing about your experience has really changed. It's just your labeling of it being good or bad that's changed.
Right.
So in your example,
So it seems like you were, if it's the second way, then it seems like it's possible you were mistaken about the kind of experience you were having.
well, in that case, I don't think so, because the experience is the same in either way. The only thing that's changed is whether you think it's good or bad. Because in that case, you weren't wrong about the experience. Again, you were just wrong about the label. You labeled it as bad or you labeled it as good. But if the experience didn't change, how could you be wrong about the experience?
The experience, you could be wrong about it because the way it seemed was like bad ranch dressing.
Well, can good and bad
That
be?
taste seemed like rotten, bad, like rotten ranch dressing. And in the other case, it seemed like good blue cheese dressing, but the taste throughout was the same. Let me try a different example and see what you think about this, because secretly I agree with you. So I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yep.
Remember that. So
Yep.
just keep that in mind. I'm doing my best to push the other line, but I do believe I'm not a zombie, and I usually like punch anyone who says otherwise. So don't punch me, Tom.
It's too much The Last of Us. I think you've been playing a little too much.
Exactly. Oh man, I know. Yeah, so that's a different story. But I was playing GTA 4 for a while, and then I was in my car, stopped at a stoplight. I should just run these people down, man. Why am I stopped here? I was like, oh shit, I gotta stop.
Bonus points.
Exactly. No. Okay. So let's try a different example and see what you think about this. So let's talk about the phenomenon of dental fear, which I recently experienced. So I can give you some firsthand insights to it. So this is something that dentists report. So you go to the dentist, they give you anesthesia, and they numb the nerve, and then they start drilling the tooth. And in some circumstances, people will report that they still feel pain. Okay. Even though the tooth is numbed. And so what the dentist does is they sort of explain to the person, they say, look, you can't be feeling pain because the nerve is dead. The nerve is numbed. So what's really happening is you're experiencing vibrations and you're afraid. And so you interpret that as being pain. And then they go back to drilling and the person says, oh yeah, it doesn't hurt anymore. So now before that happened, was the person wrong? And when this happened to me, I'll tell you, it was bizarre because I was in the dentist chair and, my dentist knows I'm a philosopher and he's always trying to have these, he like loves Sam Harrison and he's always trying to talk to me about shit. And, he's got his hands in my fucking mouth and I'm like, I can't talk to you right now. Anyway, so when it happened to me, I was like, dude, this hurts. And he was like, oh, okay, I'll give you some more Novocaine. And then he put the needle in my mouth and then he went back to drilling. I was like, oh, it feels much better. And then he was like, I didn't give you any more Novocaine. I was like, you motherfucker, dude. So, but it really, so was I wrong about, did I have a pain, in other words, or does the person under these circumstances have a pain? Or are they simply misinterpreting the vibration and the fear and mistakenly labeling it as pain or something like that? So if it's the second one, then they're wrong about the thing that they're experiencing. They're making a mistake.
Well, I would say it's the same thing as the blue cheese. I think that those sensations that they're having of just the vibration and the physical sensations combined with their priming causes them to have the same sensation of pain. So they're really feeling pain, but it's not from the nerve. The nerve isn't causing the pain. What's causing the pain is that the excitations in the neuroplasticity are causing the pain to come from your brain. So you can, just like when you're dreaming, you can think of a painful experience or like being bitten by a zombie and you feel the pain in the dream. It's really there, even though there's nothing outside that actually hurting your body, because all of your physical sensations can be replicated by your brain and are replicated by your brain in the process of imagination and dreaming. And so I think that that same thing can happen is when you have enough of the priming going on and enough of the ancillary sensory experiences like the vibration and the fact that there's a dentist in front of you and there's a drill going on, then the same kind of things can happen as if you're in a dream and you think you're being bitten by a zombie. You actually do feel the pain. It is a real sensation, but it doesn't come from the nerve. It comes from your brain.
Yeah, but that's an empirical question. So what we'd want to see is, like, under those conditions, is there activity in the brain which correlates with what we think is pain, like in the cingulate cortex or wherever the fuck it is. So it doesn't matter. But so suppose we think that, this part of the brain is associated with the conscious experience of pain. And then we put you in the fMRI scanner and we induce this state in you. And then we say, look, bro, sorry, that's just not there. So it's possible that we would find, like you're saying, because it's true. You imagine playing tennis and the motor cortex lights up less than you moving your arm, but still we know that. And as you say, when you dream, those areas of the brain are activated. So
this would be a great test for dualism. Dualism now has an empirical test they could do to get evidence.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know if this is really a test for dualism, but it's a test for whether you're a zombie, whether in introspection or whether our access to our conscious experience grounds our knowledge that we're in that kind of experience, whether we know we're experiencing what we think we're experiencing, in other words. So I think it's separate than the question of dualism. And lots of non-dualists buy this kind of argument. So Dan Dennett is not a dualist. Who knows what the hell he is? Dennett's kind of slippery.
Consciousness is fake. There's no consciousness.
Yeah, well, it's not clear that that's really what he says.
He gets angry at people when you say that.
Way.
Yeah, he gets angry if you tell them that. So.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Because he doesn't say that. I don't really believe that's his position. What I think his position is, consciousness doesn't exist in the way we think it does. By the way, just in case anyone cares, I'm going to be talking to an illusionist on my Consciousness Live show next week on Thursday on the 17th, a guy named Francois Cameret, who's he says, no one's ever felt pain before. He's like, oh, okay, cool.
Let me test that. Here's a hammer.
Yeah, well, exactly. So what they think is you have certain behavioral reactions and there are certain brain states going on, but they think that we mischaracterize those or mislabel them, so that we mistakenly believe that these things have properties which they don't actually have. And one of those properties is that they are conscious, that we mistakenly believe that they feel a certain way or they have a phenomenal property or something like that. But anyway, so I think that what Dennett actually believes is that we're just that we mischaracterize what's really happening in such a way that this is sort of what all the eliminatives say. So Patricia Churchland, Paul Churchland, they don't really believe there is no mind. What they think is that the way we intuitively think about the mind is false. So that when they say that there are no beliefs or that things like that, they don't really mean what it sounds like they're saying. What they're saying is that this idea that there are like propositions or sentence-like things going around in the brain, like the way good old-fashioned art, the good old-fashioned art tells us. People thought that's wrong, but still, all the rest of the stuff is the same. So the question is, zombies will go. So if there are philosophical zombies, they'll go around doing all the same stuff you do. You'll punch them. They'll say, "Hey, fuck you. Why'd you punch me?" And they'll say, "Ouch, I don't like that. Stop drilling on me." And "Ooh, this chocolate tastes delicious." And they'll even say things like, "I'm phenomenally conscious and I have experience. And there's one thing that I know for sure, and that's that I experienced the world." Blah. But they're dead wrong. X hypothesis, just from the way it's set up, they're wrong about that. So Dennett my point was that Dennett's a physicalist, but he's someone who says you can't know that you're not a zombie, that there's no way for you to really be sure that you have the kinds of states that you think that you have. Now, I think he's wrong about that, but I do think that if you would allow this kind of gap to open up, and there are other areas where you could explore it as well. But anyway, so if we put you in the fMRI machine and we drill on you and you say, "Ow, that hurts," and then we show, "Look, here's the activation. It's only vibration. Here's the vibration. Here's the fear, and there's no activity in the brain that correlates with you actually feeling pain," then I think that would be bad for the view that you're defending.
Oh yeah, I think you're totally right. I think that would be a great testable prediction to be a counter to my position, though I would think it would go the other way. But I think that, yes, that would be a great evidence that would lean me away towards my position. But I think that if we do test it, we're probably going to find it's going to lean towards we do actually see the brain activity in that part of the brain, which is why you feel it, kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I think
it's important to recognize that when Dennis talking and people like that are talking about like rejecting quality and all that stuff, they really have like a theoretically loaded notion of what that stuff means. So when Dennis says there's no quality, what he means is there's no, ineffable, subjective, intrinsic, private thing. And he would deny that actually the thing we started out with, that you can't express what it's like in language. If you have the right language, you capture exactly what it's like, according to him. His Robo-Mary thought experiment he points to. I'm not a big fan of Dennett. In fact, the whole reason I like him as a person, but the whole reason I got into philosophy as an undergraduate was arguing against Dennett. I was like, this guy's a fucking ass, dude. Like, people can just go around and say this stuff. And then the more I thought about it, the more I worked on this, I realized actually he's very smart and the position is defensible and people misunderstand it, including me. So I do think it should be taken seriously. But
oh yeah, and I totally agree. I think that because of the way it's phrased, it's mischaracterized as like what I said. Oh, he thinks consciousness is fake, and they just dismiss it based off of that mischaracterization. That happens a lot in philosophy, like especially with I think therefore I am. They do the same thing. It's like, oh no, Bertrand Russell debunked that. I'm like, no, that's not what I mean by that argument. So it's a different interpretation. And so yeah, that's a big problem of getting people to just apply the principle of charity and then look a little deeper.
Yeah, I know this is something that I talk about a lot with my students. It's like, it's really easy, and I was guilty of this myself. It's really easy to tear someone else down and say all the things that's stupid about them. It's really hard to ask yourself, why would a smart person say something I disagree with? To sort of figure out why. So obviously you're smart, but why are you saying these things that I think are absurd? Let me put myself over in your position and see what reasons you think for having it. And so I think that's harder to do, and it's not something that we do very well. We're not very good at it, actually. So it's easy to straw man, mischaracterize, caricature, and all those sorts of things.
Oh yeah, definitely. I've been working with like writing a curriculum for philosophy where we build like a number line of all the different beliefs and positions of things, and then you try to build it for yourself and then build it for another person to see what theirs like. So what is an idealist? How do they interpret these set of facts?
Right.
It's a super fun thought experiment, and then you can compare with each other, and you give each other's graphs, and you say, "This is dumb. This isn't my position. How could you possibly think I said this?"
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I do think that Dennett has a serious position. But anyway, so those are the ways in which you would sort of try to get someone to admit, to see why it might be possible that you don't know that you exist or that you have conscious experience, at least in the way that you the way that you characterize it. But even more conceptually, so if it's possible, so the zombie thing, I think, is what these guys want to push a lot. So what they want to say is, look, if it's possible that there are zombies, then zombies will say all the same stuff that we do for all the same reasons that we do, because they're physically just like us. So how do you know that's not you right now? Why? How can we rule that out? Now, the obvious answer is, well, because I know I'm conscious, but the zombie will say the same thing. Now, the difference between us and the zombie is hard to pin down because we're identical. So that seems bad, which is why I want to say, well, let's just rule them out at the beginning, get rid of the zombies.
Yeah, I've heard that the position that philosophical zombies are logically impossible because you have all of the same states. You will have consciousness necessarily, kind of a position.
Yeah, that's my position.
So I definitely
that's
think,
one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, so I think.
No, you go ahead.
I definitely think philosophical zombies are possible in the sense that someone else could be a philosophical zombie. Like we could build a computer that with sufficient enough complexity to fool me into thinking they're a person. I absolutely think that's possible, 100% possible. And it's possible it doesn't have consciousness. So I think philosophical zombies in that sense are possible. But I don't think it's possible for me to be one, because I think the whole point of a philosophical zombie is they don't have conscious experience. And so whether or not you can know I have conscious experience, I know I have conscious experience, so I can know I'm not a philosophical zombie. And I don't see a way around that. I don't know how I could possibly be a philosophical zombie in the way that they're arguing.
Yeah, but that's what a zombie would say.
Yeah, so you'd never know.
But even the zombie wouldn't know. I mean, do you agree with that?
Well, I don't know if the zombie could technically know anything if doesn't have conscious experience. So I'd have to think about that. I definitely think that the zombie, I don't know if knowledge is possible for the zombie, if it can even have beliefs, if it doesn't have consciousness, or if it's just a computational.
That is a problem.
Yeah. So,
but let's they have some state, which let's call it belief star or whatever you want to call it. They have something like that, which is physically identical to the state that you have when you believe something, just without the consciousness bit. So they have that. They have reason star, belief star. So you can just use star properties if you don't think they really, because I agree with you. I think that without consciousness, they probably don't have beliefs. And, that's a wrinkle that you have to take. But you could just introduce this kind of technical thing. So they have belief stars. So how do you know you have beliefs and not belief star? You have it's hard to, if you allow zombies to be possible in the first place, then it's hard to see why you think you don't have belief stars, because you have all the same reasons for thinking that you do physically. They're identical to you. So the case of the computer is not exactly the same thing because it's not physically identical to you.
I actually go the other way. So I think that we can actually make computers who are conscious. I disagree that it's purely biological and like gold. I think that there is some form of consciousness that is computational, and we'll be able to make a kind of computer consciousness. So even if there's kind of a biological consciousness, I think we will also be able to make a computer consciousness. And so I think that there is going to be some differentiating factor between the computers that are not conscious and the computers that are conscious. And so some will be able to have the belief stars and say they're conscious, but just be philosophical zombies. And some will actually have the product of consciousness. And I have no idea how to differentiate those two, but I think there is going to be a way.
Yeah, interesting. But still, they're not physically. So what really to get this is that you have to have something physically identical, like exactly the same physical system with the same physical states, with the same laws which govern the transition between those states. That's a higher bar. So if you have that, if you allow that, that's possible. So I thought that's what you were saying.
Oh no. So I don't think. Because the only part I granted was I think it's possible to make a computer of sufficient complexity that I cannot distinguish between it and a conscious being. Now, I think it's not possible to make something that is particle for particle indistinguishable with a conscious being that isn't conscious. Because I think consciousness is some physical thing in the brain somewhere. So that kind of philosophical zombie is impossible. But it's definitely possible to make a computer that could fool me. That I grant immediately.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I agree too. I agree about the computer thing, but So you deny that zombies are possible?
Yeah, the literal every particle is the exact same. I don't think that's possible.
Okay. So I thought earlier you said that you allowed that was possible. So if you don't think that's possible, then I think you have a stronger case for saying that you're not a zombie. But how do we know it's not possible, I guess, is really the question.
Yeah, I think that thought experiment, which I'd never thought of before, that you brought forward, where we do an fMRI of someone who's experiencing these kind of false sensory experiences. And if there is no brain correlate for that, that would be that I would count that as even evidence for idealism, potentially, not great evidence, but some kind of an evidence, because that would be a really cool phenomenon. If we're experiencing things that are not in the brain, that's sufficient evidence to like that we should investigate more. And so, yeah, and I'd never thought of that. That was really cool.
So, not to, sorry to interrupt you, but go ahead.
Oh, no, I think that would be a really awesome experiment to do that we should definitely do that I'd never thought of before. So thank you for that.
Cool, but I wasn't suggesting that it would be that you should interpret it as saying that you're experiencing something that's not in the brain. Rather, I would say that you're not experiencing what you think you are, is what that would show. So I think that's the friendlier interpretation of that sort of. So I would say that in such a case, that person is not experiencing pain. They're experiencing vibrations and fear, and mistakenly thinking they're experiencing pain.
It's interesting. How could you mistakenly think you're experiencing pain? Like, so isn't the experience itself just the like, how could you think you're experiencing something but not be experiencing it? I'm trying to process through that because I can understand just mislabeling something, and so it's just a false labeling in the brain or whatever, and really you're not experiencing it at all. But that would be essentially you're just not experiencing it and you've just mislabeled it. How can it be experiencing it and have it be a false experience? That seems to be a contradiction.
Well, you're experiencing vibration and fear and mistaken that is pain.
I can definitely see that as happening because we do that all the time. But I don't know if that would count as actually having a false experience, because the experience is the same. It's just the label.
Well, it was not a false experience, but what I was trying to suggest was that there are cases where you're wrong about what you're experiencing. And if you open that wedge up, then you can kind of push your way towards, well, you could be wrong about having experienced at all.
Kind of like a slippery slope. Take it to its extreme and see where it leads. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So if you think that there are cases where, and it's different. I see people talking about phantom pain over here. That's different because phantom pain is real pain. It's not hallucinatory pain. People with phantom limb pain, they get morphine. They get morphine for a good reason because it fucking hurts, dude. Phantom limb pain is excruciating. I know you know about V.S. Ramachandran and his work in this area, but
yeah, which is absolutely fascinating. Where he uses the mirror to and it stops their pain as soon as he shows them the mirror that their arm isn't there. I think that's a great analogy of kind of the conversation we've been having because I think it's the same kind of phenomenon from my perspective.
Yeah, so it's not that they shows them the mirror and they see their arm is missing. Rather, it's they see their arm as being there in the mirror, and then they open and close their hand, and that gives them some feedback, which updates the representation of that thing as opening or closing or whatever. But even weirder, Ramachandran showed that if you pour cold water into the ear of some of these people, it goes away. I mean, just bizarre stuff. He's a genius, obviously, so his work is just amazing.
The Sherlock Holmes of the brain, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, for real. Wasn't that a documentary or something? They did something like that. Yeah, okay. No doubt. No formal training or anything, just kind of a savant guy. He just said, hey, I want to design some experiments, wandered around and said, hey. Anyway, so we should all be so lucky. The point about phantom limb pain, though, is that it's real pain. It's not fake pain. It's not that they're wrong about being in pain. In fact, Descartes knew about phantom limb pain. He talks about it in the Discourse on Method. And he says, this is part of his reason for believing that the pains are representational, that, they're in the mind, that they're mental things, not part of anywhere in the body. But so phantom limb pain is real pain. What I was trying to go for was a case where you mistakenly believe you're in pain when you're not. And if that is possible, then it's only a hop, skip, and a jump down the road to mistakenly believing you're in pain when you're not in any having any experience. So those are the sorts of things that I was trying to get at. And, there are other cases too. So I don't know how familiar you are with do you know about this debate that's going on about what's called phenomenological overflow, sort of coming from Ned Block or
I've definitely heard of phenomenology, a different the perspective. I think Dan Dennett holds to one where consciousness is epiphenomenal in that kind of sense. I don't know, is that related?
Not necessarily. Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure, but so this is supposed to be the idea. So there's a classic set of experiments coming from a guy named George Sperling, who was at NYU in the 1960s. And what he did was, so he took some letters, right? So you have this array of letters, or 4 letters, 3 rows of 4 letters. And and you flash them up on the screen for 100 milliseconds, so really, really quick. And then you ask people to name all of the letters which they saw. And people are very bad at this. They get about 4 or so. Usually wherever they happen to be attending at that second, they can get a couple of letters there, and then the rest are just gone. And so what Sperling wondered is, does this mean that they don't represent all of the letters, like the information's not there, or is there some way that you can try to figure out whether they represent more than they're able to recall? So what he came up with was something called the partial report paradigm. And so what you do is you flash the letters again, but then right after you play a sound, a cue. And so there's 3 different sounds: a high-pitched sound, a mid sound, and a low sound. And if you hear the high-pitched sound, you're supposed to report the top row of letters. If you hear the middle sound, you report the middle. If you hear the low sound, you report the lower one. So the sequence goes letters, 100 milliseconds, then the letters are gone. Then right after the tone gets played, then you report the letters in the row that you were cued to. And subjects do much better. So they get, on average 3 or 4 from the row that's cued, which indicates that they must have had between 8 and 10 of the letters altogether represented somewhere. This is what's called iconic memory in psychology nowadays. And so there's a debate, though, about whether or not the information which is represented is consciously experienced. So some people think that you do experience every letter in its detail, all 12 of them, or 10 of them at least, 8 to 10. Whereas other people think, no, you experience only what you're like attending to or focused on or something, and the rest are kind of just like generic representations, like something is there, something or other is there. Okay, so one way that this, and the debate still rages, by the way. This is something that I'm very interested in, and we're actually trying to design some experiments to test some of these ideas right now.
I actually take the second route. I think we are only consciously experience of what we're directly attending, and then only after we try to make an association with like the sound and try to focus on an area, then it's sent and processed to the conscious mind. So it's all stored in the subconscious, but we only actually experience the part we're attending to, in my perspective.
Okay, so good. Then that's what's called, the sparse view as opposed to the rich view, and there are people who defend that, and so you're in good company. So a lot of people report, not everyone, but actually there's actually some work that's been done on this recently, but to show that it may be less people than we think. But anyway, so some people report that they feel like they saw all the letters. They say, I think I saw all the letters. I just can't tell you what their names are, what letters they were. So there seems to be a case where you think you have an experience that you don't.
Sure, I could see that. I mean, I don't know if, because your eye can only process about that much. If you like hold up the thumb, like that much is how much your eye can process at a time. So I don't know if it's even possible for the eye to generate that much information to be able to see that many letters at once, unless it was all really small, packed into a tight little space. But
well, no, you mean you could only foveate on a small area, but there's more to the eye than the fovea.
Yeah, but can it process that level of detail at that higher range to be able to actually process all?
Well, you have to in order to be able to do the task.
What do you? Oh, I see what you mean. Because if you're just staring at one location and they flash it up, do you think they're not like their eyes aren't scanning the whole thing the entire time when it flashes, or are their eyes all fixed?
So remember that the thing is put on the screen and then it's taken away, and then the tone is played.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is gone. There's nowhere to scan. There's nothing to look at anymore. It's gone.
Well, like when it flashes up.
So you must have represented. So the information about the letters must be in the brain somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. But when the image flashes up, is their eyes scanning the image, or is it fixed on a single point in the image?
It's a fixation cross, and that's why it's done so quick. In fact, the reason why it's presented so quickly is to avoid saccades. Because 100 milliseconds is quicker than the eye can move around. So it's actually flash, and you only get one shot. It's like a flash.
Definitely.
And you can't move around or scan actually. But yet a lot of people feel like they did see all the letters. And if they're mistaken about that, if they didn't consciously experience all the letters, but they think that they do, then there's a case where you think you had an experience that you didn't have, which kind of was the wedge that I was trying to open up.
Yep.
Remember, I'm really on your side, so
Yep.
I'm being an
Yep.
ass about this. But don't forget,
No, I
I'm only
appreciate it. This is fun. I love going through these thought experiments and having these discussions and exploring the arguments from the other side of the issue. Like you said, steel manning the other position is a really important thing that's missing in society. So I
yeah.
think this is awesome and fun. But yeah,
Okay,
I
cool. I
still
don't want anybody out there to you know, sully my good name. Say, that fucking Richard Brown is blah blah. No, no, no.
he's actually an idealist. Richard Brown is an idealist. He's just been
Yeah,
adopted by
exactly.
Bernardo Castro. He was convinced. Like, send him your clip so he can
Yeah,
put this on his
no.
YouTube channel.
I don't know if you saw the discussion I had with Bernardo one on one, but as opposed to the one I had with him and Philip. But so I didn't do what you did because I watched the one that where you talked to him. I didn't try to challenge him on the explanatory gap stuff. I was just trying to basically argue that his view has an explanatory gap on its own. And I don't really think that, you know, that's one of the problems with all these other views. The same with Philip, by the way. You tell Philip when you fucking see him that I said, dude, solve this problem. But it's like, yeah, so it's like you think there's this big problem, you come up with this theory, and then we just regenerate the problem. It's a revenge problem, you know, like a liar's paradox, revenge type of thing. It's like there's a strengthened sort of got the same problem, dude, same problem. You know, so I really anyway, so I don't want to get distracted, but I do really find it odd that people are so motivated to avoid just like thinking that the mind is physical. I don't understand, in some sense, like the motivation that they have for doing these backflips and cartwheels and tying themselves up in these knots, as opposed to simply saying, look, you know, and I'm not a functionalist. So I do think functionalism, it's hard for me to take functionalism or computationalism seriously. I try, but it really does. It is hard for me to see how, you know, consciousness could be computational. And I don't think there are any good arguments for it. By the way, just as FYI, you know, I think the best arguments that you have for it are the ones that Chalmers gives, his dancing and fading qualia arguments. And I think those have been empirically refuted and by some of the kind of considerations that we're talking about. So if you take the thought experiment, you know, the basic idea is you replace one neuron with a computer chip and another neuron, and eventually until they're all replaced. And so the idea is, well, at the end, you got to have conscious experience. Otherwise, you have to say something weird, like we could have changes in our conscious experience that are so large that we don't notice, which seems unintuitive. And then we discovered change blindness. And well, actually, it's not that weird to have giant changes that you don't notice, presumably in the things you're experiencing even. And then you take this kind of Sperling stuff we we're just talking about. It seems to me that there's cases where you have sparse experience but don't really realize it. You think that it's rich and detailed when really it isn't, so that it really doesn't seem like that high of a price to pay to say that, yes, in these cases you would have sort of fading out but not notice it, or you would have things popping and not notice it. That actually empirically seems to be what we discovered. So my general approach is to lean heavily on the science and to say, you know, all of this, your thought experiments are great. People are smart. I love it. But let's do the science and then see where we stand. Science first and then thought experiments second, as opposed to the other way around, to say thought experiments first, then, you know, fill in the details with the science.
I totally empiricism over rationalism, definitely.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think
exactly.
yeah, I think
but that's why at my darker moments, I am a semi-rationalist, and that's why I do the Chamby argument. So I say, look, even if I'm a rationalist, though, I think it's perfectly conceivable that consciousness is physical. And in fact, when Bernardo says, "Do you really believe that?" I was like, "Well, what's wrong with it? Show me if there's something contradictory about it, then I will give it up. But what's contradictory? Like what? Yes, this bit of consciousness is just some activity in the brain. Change my mind. Like what's well, I can conceive and I can imagine. It's like, oh, well, I can conceive and I can imagine too. Like, let's see who's got the bigger brain here. Can I conceive better than you? Can you conceive better than me? Once you put it that way, then it's clear that it's just intuition mongering.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And
that's like,
say, oh, in the history, it's always been so hard. Actually, no, dude. Democritus was the arch physicalist. He thought it was just like a special shape of atom, like a crescent shape. That's what consciousness was. Like what? A crescent shaped atom? Yeah, he thought it was fine. Like, I don't know. It doesn't seem that hard for lots of people to imagine.
Yeah, I totally agree when you were talking about how their position seems to have the same problems that the materialist position does. That's what I was talking about in the beginning, about the difference between saying consciousness is fundamental versus saying it's a composite. Even if you say it's a fundamental, that whole category of fundamental things doesn't seem to be a real thing. It's like saying green pixies. It's like we have no way to make that a meaningful statement. It's just kind of an intuitive thing. And is Bernardo's main argument, well, if you had a big enough system of water pipes, could you produce consciousness out of it? I mean, it seems counterintuitive, but if you think consciousness is computational, then yeah, that should be possible perfectly well.
Right.
So,
but you don't have to be an idealist to make that. I mean, Bernardo is an idealist and he says that, but I'm not an idealist and I would also say that.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so I don't think that has anything to do with idealism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the part of Bernardo where he thinks life is somehow special or important or something. I wouldn't go that far. I actually talked to someone who thinks plants are conscious. She's a scientist, actually, Monica Galliano. And I'm just not convinced. I think that what we can't deny, what's important to understand is that plants are more sophisticated than we think. They do computations, they can learn, they do store information, but there's no reason to believe that they have experiences because all that stuff we do, we can do unconsciously.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's the big question: is what is really consciousness, and if does like C. elegans have consciousness? Is it just the
Right.
computation? Is it just those relationships between the atoms? Like, forget with that, the largest organism on planet is that one like big bacterial growth thing, fungus,
Right.
and is
Yeah.
that conscious? It's the biggest brain ever, if it was. So yeah, there's definitely trying to understand what consciousness really is the big issue, and that would be my last question for you as we try to wrap up. But do you think we are going to be able to make conscious computers at some point?
With respect to the conscious computers who may be listening to this later, I'm skeptical. don't come and get me, and please upload me to the Matrix if you are there. But I am skeptical. So I'm even skeptical about just AI. Forget about consciousness. I'm skeptical just that we will reach the level of having a general intelligence because I tend to be convinced by the arguments of people like Gary Marcus, NYU, who think that intelligence is kind of a bag of tricks that doesn't scale up, and that there's no single thing which we can find. So we're good. We got AlphaZero. We have the self-driving car, but can we combine them in a coherent way so that we can have something that does both? It's not clear to me that we can. And even the most sophisticated thing which came out recently, which is GPT-3, which I don't know if you're familiar with GPT-3. If you aren't, and to anyone who cares, I recommend that you go immediately online and check out something called AI Dungeon, which is a game that you can play, and it's run by GPT-3, which is an artificial intelligence system. It's like an old text game, so I don't know how old you are, but when I was young, I played text games, so they had no graphics, like Zork, for instance. And you just enter, it gives you a description, and you enter a command. It's like you're in a door, you say go north. It's like a troll attack, like dodge troll. And this thing, it does that, but it's completely AI. So it's an open world. You explore it. You can do whatever you want. Like earlier, I was playing it, and I was like, it was like, you come into the room and there's a troll with a key. And I was like, I see Jay Leno standing in the corner, and it says, oh, Jay Leno comes out and tells you a joke about blah, blah, blah. And I said, ask Jay Leno what he thinks about Donald Trump. And then Jay Leno says to me, he would make a good president. And I say back, really? And Jay Leno reconsiders and says, no, actually, he's a better reality star. So that's all generated by the AI, right? There's no human involved in that generation. It's really fun, by the way. So people who are interested should check out AI Dungeon. It's free and fun to interact with. But so GPT-3 is very sophisticated, and it has even done things which surprise people. Like it was trained on the whole internet, though. They had to put the whole internet has 100 billion parameters. So it's actually, I talked to a computer scientist, and they said, well, if you factor in the number of synapses in the human brain, 100 billion isn't really that high. So it sounds like a lot of parameters, but actually it's maybe comparable to the number of synapses. Right,
I think we have 100 billion neurons, 100 trillion connections, something like that.
Yeah, possible connections, exactly. So anyway, the point is that I'm not sure, but what I was just to finish my thought. So what GPT-3 did that really surprised people was that even though it was trained only on text, it learned how to play chess. It can't play chess well. It sucks. You could beat it, but it learned the rules of chess just by reading the stuff on the internet, which is kind of surprising. It wasn't designed to do that. I mean, it's just designed to predict which word should come next in a sentence. But yet it was able to learn how to play chess. It also does causal reasoning, like if A causes B, then what will happen when B does something? See, it could figure stuff out like that. So that's pretty impressive, actually. It doesn't pass the Turing test, nothing like that, but still pretty impressive. So anyway, my point though is that I'm kind of a skeptic. So there are people who think, look, it's obvious we're going to get to AI. And then it's obvious we're going to have an intelligence explosion, and then we'll be in the singularity, and there'll be super intelligences. And I say it's possible. That's possible, but I don't think there's a clear reason at this point to believe that this is the case. And there hasn't really been any fundamentally new ideas in AI for a while. I mean, convolution and all those sorts of things are, deep learning and all that stuff are really kind of, I mean, convoluted neural networks are something that's new, but the idea behind deep learning is not something that's new. This has been around for a long time. It's just what's different now is we have the data to pump it to train it. We have a lot of stuff to feed into it, but I don't know. So I think we need something fundamentally new. So anyway, the point being that I'm very skeptical that we will get to the point of artificial consciousness, let alone artificial intelligence. However, if I met a Commander Data and he walked up to me and he said, Richard, I'm really disappointed in you for talking all this shit about me, I would say, I am sorry, Commander Data. So if I were confronted with it empirically, I wouldn't be one of those people who say, oh, it's just a machine, it doesn't feel. I would say,
you're a philosophical zombie, and then he punches you in the face. Like, this is what you said
exactly.
to do.
I wouldn't do that. I would change my mind and be like, okay, so that's good reason to believe it's conscious and that I was wrong. So I'm not one of these people who think, no matter, like Searle, he's like, no matter how sophisticated it is, it's just simulating conscious experience. I'm not that hardcore. I just think that empirically, probably we're not going to get to that point. And I don't really buy arguments about uploading and cognitive enhancement, because I think that, they function much the same way glasses do. If I put my glasses on, that doesn't mean that my eyes are robotic. It just means there's something that can interface with my eyes. So I tend to think the same way about neuroprosthetics and things like that. But I think, again, these are empirical questions that are open for waiting and seeing. So while I'm skeptical, I'm willing to be convinced about our consciousness.
I think that's a really smart position. I usually take the position, if it can be done, science can do it, and science can do anything regardless of whether or not I can imagine it, because the past just shows pretty much everyone says something's impossible. Computers will never be better than people at chess. Humans will never be able to fly faster than the speed of sound. Humans will never be able to go to space. So just the litany of human past is like, we say it can't be done, and science is like, you're dumb. And so I take the position, science can do it. That's my default.
Meta-inductive arguments for the success of science. Yeah. The question is whether consciousness is different. And I think that's really what it all boils down to. So because in every other case, I mean, a lot of people want to compare consciousness to life, but life is not the same, because even when it wasn't clear whether life was something physical or not, what was clear is that it's functional, that being alive is simply doing certain functions, having certain functions, reproduction, maintaining integrity of the body, etc. What wasn't clear was whether something physical could perform those functions. So it's not 100% clear that consciousness is that way, because on the face of it, consciousness seems to be separatable from function, as evidenced by the kind of conceivability of zombies and merry thought experiments. Doesn't mean it really is, but at least seems like it's open that it could be different in a way that things like life aren't. And so, I think that's a possibility.
Do you think that if computers gain enough control over nanomachines, that they could essentially, if consciousness is only present in biology and we can make mechanical nanomachines to manipulate biology, to control biology, then the machines could achieve consciousness that way?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So I do think that, obviously, like, I'm not a supernaturalist in any sort of way. So I think that the human body is a kind of machine, and the brain is a kind of machine. I don't know if it's a classical computer. I think it does compute. It may be compute in a non-classical way. I don't think that's been established at this point. But I certainly think that the idea of computational neuroscience is on the right track, that there are algorithms that the brain is running. And so it's clear to me that consciousness can be produced by mechanical processes, but it's not clear to me that those processes are computational. And so, I even think this is Searle's view, actually. When I was an undergraduate, I had a class with Searle in San Francisco. As far as I understand his view, it is that his only objection is that digital computers can be conscious. His objection is not that we could build an artificial system that had consciousness, as long as it sort of was built in the way the brain is built. So because the brain is, not an artificial system. Well, I don't know, if there's a God and God created humans, then are we artificial systems? I think that's a challenge to people who believe in God. But for us non-believers, I guess. Well, technically, I don't know. So can I ask you a question before we
Sure,
go?
absolutely.
I don't know what your time frame is, but I got a little bit of time, if you don't mind. So, I mean, I really admire first of all, let me just say, I admire your channel and what you do.
Thank you.
I think it's really cool that you're out there fighting the good fight. I am a little bit curious about your definition of atheism. And so let me just preface that by saying that I officially call myself an agnostic, but I don't know if we mean the same thing by that. So I was kind of a natural born atheist, to be honest. When I was raised in a very religious household, super, super, super religious. And my first reaction to hearing all that was like, this is bullshit. Like, I literally couldn't believe it. I just found it like unbelievable in like the strictest and literal sense of that world. Not that they were supernatural beings, but that they were accurately describing them. I was like, this sounds like some asshole you're describing.
Yeah, you got the rib woman who was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree. I don't know about this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that God would just like force us to show up here against our will and then say, follow me or die. That just seemed to me to be hugely immoral. Like, it's like, but he gave you a gift and then said, if you don't accept it, then you're going to be fucking dead. I was like, okay. Sounds like a jerk. And honestly, I always felt like Satan was the good guy in the Bible. I was like, Satan is like for humans, right? He's the only one who cares about us. Are you kidding me? And that didn't go over well in my household, by the way.
Just compare the death counts. Like, how many people God killed? Satan only killed like a dozen. Who's the bad guy here?
Yeah, exactly. I was like, yeah. And in a certain way, there's a sense in which you can read like the Garden of Eden story as kind of like a philosophical story, because what they're interested in is knowing the difference between good and evil. And God says you can't do that, and Satan says, well, who is he to tell you? And really, that's the sort of role that philosophy has played. I'd say, is like trying to discover these ideas. What is there good and bad? I know you're an objectivist about morality, although you deny moral internalism or something like that, which I find suspicious. But anyway, so there's all these sorts of things going on. And honestly, I was like into Satanism as a teenager. And obviously, if you know anything about Satanism, it's not like you worship Satan. It's just that you sort of say, God's a jerk.
Essentially, it's just humanism. I once made the mistake.
But I like to think of it as
I have a few Satanists in my atheist group, and I once made the mistake of confusing them with the Church of Satan. They got very angry with me because the Church of Satan actually does worship Satan.
Yeah. Well, no, they don't actually.
Oh, really?
The LaVey, no, they don't. They're basically atheists too. But the difference between the Satanic Temple and the Church of Satan is that the Church of Satan is basically Ayn Rand with some rituals on it. So it's basically philosophical egoism, which I don't like, and I never did like actually. Satanic Temple is basically humanism, as you say. That's exactly right. But neither of those things are devil worshippers in the sense that they believe, although there is some association with like Anton LaVey and Aleister Crowley. And so there are some weird, I think you can make the case that maybe some of those people, anyway, that we're getting off the topic. So my point though, is that, I was kind of a natural born atheist. Like from the very beginning, I just found it very implausible. Like I just could not believe it. And I was thinking of millions of alternate explanations. But as I grew up over time, so I'm definitely an atheist about any known religion. Like I think Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism. I'm atheist about all that stuff. Zoroastrianism, whatever. But where I'm not so sure is just about more abstract ideas about, is there a first cause? Is there something that transcends reality, which had a causal role in producing reality? Whether that means, and what's interesting is you can get all that stuff in a simulation. So, if we're in a simulation right now, the people outside the simulation know everything about it. They're all powerful with respect to it. So in a sense, they created it. So they would meet all the traditional criteria that a theist would want. So are they God? Should we be worshiping the simulators? Yeah, that seems a bit weird. But anyway, so I think that those questions are important. But the way I hear you define it, because you sound like an agnostic to me, that's where this is a long-winded way of saying that I think that the way you talk sounds more like agnosticism than atheism, in the sense that you think there's no good reason to believe in God, as opposed to a reason not to believe in God. And those seem to me to be different because, I'm an atheist, a Santist. I don't believe in Santa, spoiler alert. And I think there are good reasons not to believe in Santa. But I think the case is different when we're talking about this abstract transcendental thing. I think there are some reasons for thinking that there is such a thing, cosmological arguments, even the ontological argument, and to some degree, depending on the problem here is the Bayesian priors, like what you consider more likely about necessary beings and so forth. Cosmological argument, fine-tuning argument. I think there are reasons against believing in God, the problem of evil being the most significant for me. So I think, my own view, when I was little, I remember when I was 14, I was like, why aren't we photosynthetic? Like, how come this asshole God didn't make us photosynthesize? Like, I'm sick of eating. It's disgusting. I don't want to chew shit up in my mouth and have this disgusting biological waste come out. I want to absorb light, like pure, like a plant. Like, that's the way you would do it, right? Why aren't there animals that are photosynthetic? It seems to me like really conclusive to me that the system is flawed. Anyway, so I'm getting off the point. The point is, I think that there's evidence on both sides, and I get the feeling that you don't think that. So I wonder. First, I don't know. I've gone on long enough. Let me hear what you have to say about any of this.
Yeah, so my position is mostly epistemic. So I don't usually the reason people believe in a God is usually emotional reasons, not logical reasons. So the arguments really have nothing to do with whether or not they actually believe a God exists. That's usually just some kind of post hoc justification. So my main interest is, do the arguments actually work? Is it actually evidence for there to be a God? And by God, I mean some kind of a non-conscious or a non-physical mind of some kind that created everything else. The origin of literally everything that is conscious. And I think, no, we have pretty good reason to conclude that is not the case. Because as far as we can tell, consciousness is a product of minds in some case, only a result of physical processes. The idea that a mind itself can be the fundamental thing of everything doesn't seem to make much sense, because minds seem to have to be made of other things. And so I take the position that everything is imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. Until you have some kind of evidence to conclude it's not imaginary, it's probably imaginary. And so I conclude that every God concept that we could ever come up with, real or imaginary, even the ones we've never come up with yet, are all imaginary until you have some reason to indicate otherwise. And all of the arguments used, like the cosmological, the teleological, I think the ontological is so dumb, I can't stand that argument, but all of the physical ones can be answered by a natural thing that isn't conscious that can do all of those things. Like, we can have a necessary natural thing that created space-time. Emergent space-time is a thing in physics. We can have a quantum mechanical particle that ties together all the different laws of physics, and so they're determined by physics with no consciousness there. So everything about the universe can be explained by an unknown natural cause, or the way I phrase it is, anything the supernatural can explain can be explained by the unknown natural. And so because of just the meta inductive argument that you mentioned earlier, I just go with, it's more reasonable to conclude it's natural and not a God. And I think that is a good argument against every conception of a God, because of it has the defeater of all of our ideas are just ideas. We have no reason to believe they actually do correspond to reality until we have some kind of secondary justification for those. Then it's plausible to just reject it as just an idea. And so for that reason, I adopt the more hard atheist label of, well, everything can be explained as just an unknown natural thing. You don't need the supernatural mind of any kind. And so I take that position, but mostly in debates, it's mostly about the epistemic question of, do these arguments actually work? And whether or not God exists really isn't the question I'm discussing in most of my conversations.
Yeah, that's why it seems like it's agnosticism that you're really discussing. It seems like what's at issue is, so I don't know. I would defend the ontological argument, by the way, in case anyone cares. I don't think it succeeds, but I don't think it's dumb. I think that if it's possible that there's a necessary being, then that necessary being is necessary. So what matters is is it possible that there is a necessary being. I actually think it's impossible. I think there are contradictions. I think that there's a contradiction entailed by God's existence having to do with free will, for example. Like, can God know in advance what God will do? If so, then God doesn't have free will. It's determined already what God will do. And God knows everything. So guess what? God knows what he will do. So therefore he can't have done otherwise. So therefore no free will. So I think that, and there are other things I think you can do as well. But I think the concept of a necessary being in and of itself entails contradictions. But if you don't find that convincing, then the fact, so that's why the Bayesian stuff. So depending on what your priors are, how likely you think these things are, you're going to come up with different things. So I think the whole question of evidence really depends on your starting point. That's the problem. So what's going to count as evidence for you is not going to count as evidence for me. And that seems to be kind of a problem here. But anyway, so that's neither here nor there. So the question, if you have something that can be explained equally well in two ways, then it seems to me like you should withhold judgment about which of the ways is right. as opposed to, so I don't take that line with Santa, right? So I don't say, well, it's possible, I know a guy who wrote a whole book on this about should we
On
believe in
Santa?
Santa? Oh yeah, yeah. His name is Eric Linus Kaplan, and he's actually a writer on Futurama and also the Big Bang Theory. He worked on that show. He was a PhD. He did a PhD in philosophy at UC Berkeley, and he's a comedian. He's a very funny guy, and he wrote this book on belief in Santa, basically where he argues, look, it's not so clear that we shouldn't believe in Santa, because it may just be that all the evidence is hidden. Maybe it's only magical children can see it. We go to North Pole and say, so it's, you can't rule out all of that other stuff, but no one takes that seriously. And the question that he was asking was, why not? Why don't we take these other counter explanations seriously? Well, because we think we have good reason for thinking there is no Santa. Take the cosmological argument, which I think is fairly strong, actually. That there must, so I think the conclusion of that is it's got to be a first cause, but it doesn't tell you much about the first cause. So it leaves it open that the first cause is like just the universe, or whether it's God that did the first cause. But why isn't that some kind of evidence that that you could, so is it good evidence? I don't know. It's some kind of evidence that there's got to be a first cause. And then you have to debate about what you mean by first causes and what kind of properties that they will have. But it's not nothing or do you think it's, I don't know. So do you think it's nothing?
Well, I go a different route. So I think everything is already defeated. Everything starts as imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. So it's already not real until you provide some good evidence outside of just a hypothesis. So if we see a cup fall over, or like we see the cosmological argument, the universe had a beginning of some kind, that's good evidence the universe had a beginning, but tells us, like you said, nothing about what the beginning is. So if you have some specific hypothesis about what that is, like a mind, well, then you're going to need something more than that argument. You're going to need something related to a mind that shows that it's more likely that a mind did this than a non-mind. Otherwise, it's just an imaginary hypothesis you came up with, and that's it. That's all you have. And so it's reasonable for me to conclude that's just something in your imagination and nothing else, because all you have is just the imaginary evidence that you've presented, but no actual evidence that it is actually a mind. So because I start with the criterion of every...
You don't have any evidence that it isn't a mind.
Well, that's the part where I disagree. So I think every belief already has a defeater, which is we make up lots of silly things. So there's lots of things we imagine that are not true about the world. And so anything we can imagine that has no reason to believe, independent of just our imagination, is probably just one of those imaginary things. It's Santa. So I think that God is like Santa. It's just a thing in someone's mind. We can trace back that this is just something someone came up with in their head and nothing more, just like Santa. So we have equally reason to believe in God as we do for Santa. And so from my perspective, I would be an atheist, a strong atheist in that sense. I think naturalism better explains literally everything, every single fact. Just like for the inductive reason of we know naturalist stuff exists and it has some impact in the world, so it's reasonable to include just white goose, white goose, white goose. Next one's probably going to be a white goose. That's good evidence for naturalism. That's good evidence for the physicalist hypothesis that the origin of the universe is physical. There is no such example for some kind of a mind in some case. Kind of like what we mentioned earlier about how Bernardo has the same problem when he says that consciousness is fundamental. Well, what do you mean by that? There's no evidence of fundamental things. How does that work? The same kind of thing applies to this God hypothesis. When you put in this idea of a mind existing out there with no supporting inductive evidence that minds can exist outside of brains, that is a good argument against that position. We have good evidence of physical stuff existing and doing stuff. So it's inductively strong to say this is what caused the universe. That is a better position than the one that it was done by this mind thing, this new ontology mind thing that we have no evidence for.
Yeah, but so take the simulation hypothesis that we were talking about before. So suppose we're in a simulation right now. Then somebody created the simulation. That person has a mind, and they're on the next level of reality up. So there's some reason to believe that there's a mind-like thing which created the universe if you accept the simulation hypothesis. Correct or no?
Yeah, if you already start by accepting the simulation hypothesis. But again, I would say everything starts as imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. So I'd say the simulation hypothesis, just something in your imagination until you can provide evidence for it. So
we have it. It's called the simulation argument.
Well, I don't consider the argument to be an evidence. I consider the argument to be a hypothesis builder. So I think arguments aren't in themselves evidence until you have something that shows they correspond to reality. Arguments are
I,
great to build hypotheses, but you have to go beyond the hypothesis to show it actually corresponds to reality.
yeah, so I think there's where we really disagree because I think arguments are evidence. In fact, I think that's kind of the philosophical method is that we treat arguments as evidence. In other words, I would say that an argument for the conclusion that P is evidence to believe that P. So it can be defeated, and there are lots of arguments that to the conclusion of which is P, which we have defeated, and so we believe not P. But I guess I think that if there's an argument around and the argument is valid, then there's a question about whether it's sound. But if it's sound, then you're logically compelled to accept the conclusion.
Right.
Or if it's code.
I totally agree, but
So
I think the
is
soundness,
evidence, then
the soundness
you're correct.
thing is what I think you need the external evidence for. I don't think you can get soundness just from the validity structure of the argument. You need the soundness part. And to get the soundness, you have to have some reference to reality, not just an a priori construct of an argument.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's interesting because I think that's just not the way. Well, I don't know. I disagree because, in mathematics, most of the things that we know about math is conditional. If such and such is the case, then this thing over here will be the case. Like if the Riemann hypothesis is true, then we can prove that something else is true. Or, if the continuum hypothesis is the case, then blah, blah, blah. So, and in fact, some of the most important proofs in mathematical are conditional in that way. And so I think a lot of the things that we know are conditional in that way. And what we can say is like, if this turns out that way, then it's got to be like this. And if it turns out the other way, then it's got to be like that. So that seems to me to count as evidence in the sense that we know that if the premises are true, then the conclusion will be true or will likely to be true if it's inductive or whatever. So that there would be a reason to accept it if you accepted the premises.
Yeah, I'm happy to grant that, but
yeah.
So
in that case, there would be evidence for persons. So this is to go back to the ontological argument because I know you hate it and I want to annoy you for our last little bit of time here. But suppose that so you don't think it's likely that there is a necessary being, but someone like Alvin Plantinga thinks it's very likely, and he came up with this what did he call it? It's not
modal ontological argument.
Yeah, but no, he called it something fancy. It was like the vigilant or the triumphant modal argument, or I don't know. He has some fancy word for it. I forget what it is.
I'm pretty sure it was the modal ontological argument, isn't it? Or is there another thing?
Yeah, no, it's the modal but he calls it the something modal art. It's like the victorious modal argument, or I don't know. It has some description for it. So what we can say is if you accept that it's likely that there's a necessary being, then that being has to exist here. If you don't, then that being doesn't exist here. So the question is whether we should accept that. That's the question. Should we accept that it's possible that there's a necessary being? But according to what you were just arguing, it seems to me that you're committed to the view that for persons who do accept it, it's rational for them to count that as evidence.
Oh, sure. So if they accept it, then if they think that method can differentiate imagination from reality, then that counts as evidence. So evidence, from my definition, is anything that can differentiate imagination from reality. So if they think they have a successful method that can do that, then that does count as evidence for them. Now, I would then debate, well, can this differentiate imagination from reality? Because I don't think it can. And that's kind of where the whole point of the conversation is does that method actually do that or not? And so I definitely agree. If they think that this method can differentiate imagination from reality, then yes, that would count as evidence for them. But I don't think it does. And that's where I don't think it counts as evidence.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of a strange definition of evidence, since I think typically people would think of evidence as something that raises your credence or justifies your belief in something. So in there, you could have evidence that, so I think that my friend on mushrooms had evidence that Snuffy was running down the hallway, namely their own experience of seeing Snuffy running down the hallway. That evidence was defeated by the fact that no one else saw it. And so we can say it was a hallucination, but nonetheless, that was evidence for them. And there's no way that they could differentiate that from being purely imaginary. So, I don't know. So we can have evidence for things that are false.
All right. So in that case, I would not count that as evidence because I'd say I had an experience of a unicorn or Fluffy. Now, for me to say that I have reason to believe it was real, I'd have to have some way to show that wasn't just imaginary. So like if I saw a dog, I could say, well, there's lots of inductive evidence of dogs. I can probably combine that with my testimony and say, yeah, that's probably not imaginary. So that's a good reason to conclude it's not imaginary. If I see a unicorn and there's no prior empirical evidence of unicorns, I can say that's probably imaginary, probably not real. But without that other method, in addition to just my experience, I would not say that that is a good reason to believe it's true just because I experienced it, because of how fallible human experience is. So I would
Right.
always need that secondary something, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be empirical evidence. That's just what I use. Something that can differentiate imagination from reality. And if you have that, then you can conclude you have evidence. If you have any method that can actually, like what you had said, is make it justify the belief that this is a thing in reality, independent of imagination, essentially the same criterion, just phrased
Right.
differently. If you
Yeah.
have that, then yes, that would count as evidence. But I don't think theists have that, which is why I don't think there's any evidence for theism.
So you don't accept that experience counts as evidence.
Directly, no, because I don't think experience can differentiate imagination from reality.
Yeah. Well, then it seems like you're going to have problems grounding your cogito.
Except in that one case, for some strange reason.
So, but then except in all these cases, I
Well,
mean, so, I think, he gives this argument that you can be rationally justified to believe in God based on your experience, that there seems like a God around. He even postulates this ridiculous thing called the divinus facultalis, or whatever, the divine faculty.
yes,
The
divine divinitus, something divinitus,
yeah.
uh, experiences divinitatis, something like that.
Yeah, something like. But so if you accept that, and he argues actually that's perfectly rational, that if you have this experience, that it's for you rational to conclude that the experience is veridical, or that it's there telling you something. And you're saying the same thing about the cogito, and you're saying, well, no, that's special. But I think that normally people, not normal persons, normally people take the experience that such and such is the case as at least a defeatable reason to believe that that is the way things are. And so you would, I agree, to have conclusive evidence, have to do something else like experimental method or something like that. But why do we need conclusive evidence? Why isn't the experience itself something that's granting absent defeaters should raise our credence or justify the belief that we have, or, so forth and so on. So if I see a chair, why do I believe there's a table here? Because I see it. Do I also got to touch it and bang on it? Well, I think I could do that, but I can also just say, well, I see the table. You can't see the table. So that table behind me. So I see it, damn it. And that's why I believe that it's there. And that's usually good enough. And I don't need to go around saying, oh, well, if it's hallucination, and yes, I could be wrong, but I think that, anyway, so I think a lot of this, and it's just something I think that really should be made clearer when you're debating, or when one is debating, not just you, but I mean, because it's not clear that everyone means the same thing by evidence. And depending on what you mean by it, you're going to end up talking past a lot of people, it seems like to me, because you're going to be saying there's no evidence, and they're going to be saying, yes, there is. And then you find out 6 hours later, oh, wait a minute, by evidence, you meant this thing, and by evidence, they meant that thing. And so actually, that seems to me to be to be a problem. So if you simply say, well, look, I need something that makes this more likely to be real than not real, then I think that, well, I don't know, at least in the simulation hypothesis, I think we have some reason to believe that it's not that we are in the simulation, but that we could be. And so, there's one of three possibilities. Well, there's actually four possibilities. One, consciousness is not computational. Or if it is, then we go extinct, or we stop doing simulation research, or we're in a simulation. So I don't think it's incorrect to say probably we're in a simulation, or there is some evidence that suggests we're in a simulation because of this argument, in which case there's some evidence that there's something outside that transcends our reality, which had a mind, which created it, and so forth. So now you say, how do you differentiate that from imagination? Well, I just gave you the reasons, because either what are the other options? Either we go extinct and so never do it, or we lose interest in doing it, or we already have done it and it's just more likely that we're one of the similar people than non-similar. That seems to me, I don't know. So I guess there's room for disagreement. I'm not saying you're wrong or anything like that. I just think it's strange to say that that's not some kind of evidence. That's not a way of differentiating these things.
All right, I totally accept your point that you need to clarify what you mean by evidence. That's something I've learned over the course of my debates, is that I usually state that what I mean by evidence is some way to differentiate, is this imaginary or is this real? And so that usually comes up in the debates, and that's my go-to explanation to try and defeat, like, oh, well, you're an empiricist, you only accept empirical evidence. Like, no, you can use whatever method you want here. Just tell me what it is and we'll see if this works. So I definitely agree that you do need to define what you mean by evidence. But I would say, again, in the case of the table, the reason that's reasonable isn't just because you saw it. It's because you saw it and you have all of this prior other beliefs about how empirical evidence works, how science works, how these testable predictions are made with tables that you can always test and repeat if you need to be. And so just because you saw it isn't the reason. That's one part. That's the conceptual side. But that, in addition to the the implicit empirical evidence, there is what makes it reasonable. Whereas if you see a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe because it lacks that empirical evidence. And so this wouldn't just apply in the case of things like unicorns, which we think are false, or Santa, which we think are false, but anything we don't know about. Like if you're walking on the beach and you saw a tesseract or something, like it would be more reasonable to conclude that's probably imaginary. You're probably under a delusion. You probably had some mushrooms and Snuffleupagus. Snuffleupagus is probably around the corner somewhere and you just haven't seen him yet. So I think that anything is in that kind of a situation where you're walking along the beach, you see this thing. If it doesn't have an empirical basis in the past, you should conclude it's imaginary, no matter what it is, which would include we're in a hypothesis, we're in a simulation, we're created in a universe by God. All of those things would be like, there's a tesseract, probably imaginary. And I actually do have arguments against the simulation hypothesis. I think that if we did create more simulated universes than real ones, we'd probably apply a moral law to them. So we'd make it, because I'm a moral realist, of course. I think that we would make them more moral, not horrible like this one. So we'd probably try to make them so that would be the case that there would be no involuntary imposition of will or something. And that would probably be the majority of the simulated universes. And since we're not in that one,
given that most of the simulations we make are like Grand Theft Auto and The Last of Us 2, it doesn't seem that's the way we trend. I mean, Call of Duty, what's moral about that? I mean, if there's conscious agents in Call of Duty, then we're fucked, dude. We're causing all kinds of damage. And it doesn't seem like that's something that we care about. It seems like, well, we care about, I don't know. So one hypothesis is, well, the simulators are simulating the 2000, what would happen if some extremely absurd thing happened? Oh, I know. Let's make Donald fucking Trump president and see what happens. Okay, let's throw, I don't know. Did you ever play The Sims? I certainly like to box my Sims in and watch them pace around and die in a room with no door. I
definitely understand your argument there, but I would totally disagree. I would think that as we progress technologically and as we have more resources to be able to simulate entire universes, our moral progress, because I do think moral progress is a thing, would lead toward the things that we would see that as immoral. If someone created a simulation with beings and they boxed them in, we would throw them in jail like, no, that is evil, do not do that. And so if we did get to the point where we could create billions of simulated universes, at that point, our moral progress would be to such an extent that this kind of universe, anybody who created it would be thrown in prison because they are horribly immoral. Like, who would do this? And so if we got to that stage, I think more universes would look more moral than what we see now. And so I think it's less likely that we are in a simulated universe, because at that stage, because I think moral realism is true, that we would be at this moral standard that this kind of universe would be not preferred and everything would have to be consensual.
Yeah, so, I mean, I would that were true. I'm a moral realist myself. I believe in like objective morality based in reason and kind of utilitarian / Kantian consideration. So I agree with you. I like your idea about the imposition of will, actually. Although I think it has some strange results, like if a rock fell on me and the rock's immoral, that seems like weird to me, actually, to call the rock immoral. But anyway, so I think barring that, I think it's a cool model and interesting. But having said that, so it's not clear to me that, well, especially on your own view, as I understand it, that we would give a shit or that we're obligated to give a shit, or that there's that we couldn't just be a moralist and be like, yeah, this is immoral, but I don't fucking care. And we're doing something. I don't really, it's an open question to me whether or not we're motivated by moral concerns in the way that we typically think that we are. Whether morality has any relation to motivation, I think, is an open question. I want it to. In fact, I defend a hybrid view of expressivism and more realism. So I think that part of what drives us are the emotions, and we have certain moral emotions, but that we can justify having certain emotions. So I think, basically when you say Hitler is immoral, what you're saying is, oh, Hitler, and that's the right way to feel about Hitler. And I think you can justify the belief about the feeling that you have. But without the emotions involved, I don't think that just the knowing of what's morally right is going to get you to do anything. Certainly not like, a Platonic person who thinks that, Socrates says, oh, well, if you just knew what was good, you would do it. It's like, no, actually, lots of people know what's good and simply do the opposite.
Yeah, like telling a Nazi that it's immoral to shoot me. They're like, that's not going to convince them. I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, exactly. It's not going to convince them. Although on that topic, it is interesting, actually. I have my students read this, the diary of Himmler, actually, who agonizes over this stuff in his diary. He says, we're murdering all these Jews and I feel terrible about it, but I got to do my duty. And it's like, I have to do it. And I've got to be strong and I can't be weak. And you read this, you're like, holy fucking shit. He actually thinks he takes morality seriously and he thinks he's doing the moral. I don't know. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting idea about, how believing in duty can sometimes lead you to do horrible things. Which is kind of a standard argument against Kantianism. Anyway, okay. So I do believe that he thought he was acting morally. He wasn't, obviously. I'm not saying that at all. No way. But he believed he was. Okay. So anyway, so I think that's a flaw in the argument that you have.
Oh yeah, I totally grant that argument. I don't think that morality is inherently motivational in that you just know it and you're going to do anything. But I do think there is a probability to it. So I think that as we gain more resources, the way we perceive other people, the scope of morality seems to be growing, and that does seem to affect our emotions. Like as we have more resources, we seem to think it's more moral to give resources to people who are in need because we have excess resources. And so I think that the foundation of morality is that process of, as we gain more resources, the scope of moral progress grows. We say, well, we can spare some more resources to help these people. And if we got to the point where we could create multiple universes and just have essentially infinite resources or whatever, our moral framework would be such that this would just seem to be the case. This would be like the law that we adopted for those people for their purely pragmatic reasons. Like, we should not hurt people. And once they realize this, they would also apply that to a larger scope, like the video game simulations. If you create a being, we got to apply the same rules to that being as we do to us, for this same moral reason, whatever it is, regardless of whether or not it's motivational. It's just, this is just what we think the rules are. So we apply these rules to the same kind of a thing, any conscious agent.
So what about this though? So suppose the simulator is like a 13-year-old incel in the next universe up. They're angry, they're pissed off, they're lonely, they want other people to suffer. So they program up a reality. Here we are, we're fucked. But yeah, the most of the other ones are produced by responsible persons. But here's, 13-year-old dude in his room in his underwear saying, fuck these bastards. Yeah, they're gonna, Donald Trump's gonna, oh, COVID. Yeah, throw COVID in there. Oh, tsunami in here. Fucking all that shit. I'm not, so again, I don't really think that what you're saying counts as evidence by your own criterion. So we don't have a way to differentiate the claim that you're making as from being imaginary. I don't think that you've established that. Appealing to moral progress doesn't seem to me to establish that that it's more probable that that's the case. But even so, right? So even if that is an argument against the simulation hypothesis, if you want to count that as evidence against the simulation hypothesis, then I think that you're agreeing with me that arguments can be evidence, which means that
two separate things.
Is self-evidence.
Well, those are two separate things. So one would be I grant the possibility that there are evil kids who just make evil universes, but I would think that because of moral progress, that's the minority. So if we're just going probabilistically, we'd probably see more of the moral universes than the immoral universes, and so that would count against the Bostrom's argument because it's based on probability. So I'm just using the probability to show that there would be a different probability. Now, the reason to believe we are in a simulation, I would say, is this is irrelevant. This makes no difference whatsoever. The arguments against it don't care at all. All that matters is there some positive reason to believe this is non-imaginary? And until you get to that point, I don't need any arguments against it. Those are totally irrelevant. I'm just going to conclude it's imaginary, and I'm justified in that based off of my epistemology, because I think I do have a way to differentiate imagination from reality, and that doesn't fit into that method. So just for that reason alone, I reject it as imaginary. And then the arguments against it, I think, are just purely for fun. They don't actually matter to the conclusion. the only basis of my conclusion this is imaginary is, well, you haven't met my criterion of evidence yet. You haven't provided a way to differentiate imagination from reality. And so I don't believe it just on that. And then I can come up with some fun arguments against it too.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I don't see why I haven't met that. By the way, I've already said I don't believe we're in the right. Just in case I see people trap talking over here at me, and that's fine. I don't give a shit. But just for the record, I don't believe we're in a simulation right now. But I don't know it, not even non-fallibly know it. I think that I'm not even sure if I'm justified to have that belief. But the only thing that I'm suggesting, this all started because you were saying, why should you want to be a strong atheist? I don't want to be called a soft atheist, by the way. I'm not a soft guy, but I prefer agnosticism because I think that it's not that I don't believe in I don't want to say the word God because I don't want to mistakenly people to think that I'm talking about like a Christian God or a Muslim God. I think all I rule that out. I just read the Bible and say, this is fantasy.
More like a deistic kind of a God, kind of that's just like a ambivalent kind of a thing out there that's minded that.
I don't even know if it's ambivalent. I just mean something that transcends what we call physical reality and had some kind of causal role in creating it. So under the simulation hypothesis, there would be such a being. That being would be whoever created the simulator. So do we have any reason to believe that we're in a simulation? I think the answer is yes. So I think the argument from design plausibly can be used as an argument for simulation. I think the cosmological argument can be plausibly used for simulation. Not the ontological arguments, obviously. The moral argument I don't buy, although I do kind of almost take seriously the version that Kant put forward. The moral argument, by which I mean, I don't believe there's any sense in which you need a God in order to be moral. I don't believe in God. I'm a pretty moral person. I'm not perfect, obviously, but I believe in morality. But the Kantian argument that it's harder to take morality seriously without belief in punishment and an afterlife. It's like, I always think about Columbine. These fuckers, they walked into the school, they shot everybody, and then what happened? They shot themselves and they got away with it. Those fuckers, like, there's no punishment. I just feel like they got away scot-free. Like, it really makes me angry, actually, that they committed suicide. And you might say, well, they're dead, right? Isn't that? I don't know. I want them, dragged in front of I want them to see the families crying. I want them to have to stand trial. I want punishment. And I think Kant's idea is like, if Hitler isn't somewhere right now having a pineapple shoved up his ass, then it's really hard to give a shit about why should I do what I think is right? How can I make sense of myself as a moral agent? If you don't get the reference, that's the Adam Sandler.
South Park.
Was it South? Yeah, it's South Park. Yeah, it's South Park. Where that happens. Yeah. I thought it was Little Nicky, but I think you're right. It's South Park. Anyway, so it's really hard to take myself seriously when I say, look, morality obligates me to do X. So why should I do X? Well, if there's no transcendental thing that kind of is making sure that things balance out, if I have to sacrifice myself for something for moral causes, why should I do that? Well, because morality says, yeah, but all right, but why should I care what morality says? So that was kind of Kant's idea, is that to make sense of ourselves as a moral agent, there's got to be something that sort of is keeping track, that it makes sense that you might have to do things which you don't want to do, and then you'll be rewarded for it later. And so, one thing that you could say is, yeah, we're in a simulation of we're being punished right now. So maybe that you could certainly imagine digital afterlives. There's a heaven and a hell simulation. There's you die and you go to the good simulation or you go to the bad simulation. Guess what? We're in the bad simulation, guys. Donald Trump's in charge and all that stuff. And so
karma, we all deserved it because we're all terrible people.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. But anyway, so I guess I just get hung up on this idea about what counts as evidence. So I do think the simulation argument is some kind of evidence. I do think the design argument is some kind of evidence. What's it evidence? Well, so how's the argument from design go? It goes like this. Well, the only thing that we've ever seen is an analogy. All the complex things that work in these ways have been designed. Here's a complex thing, so probably it was designed. Now it's inductive, so it can be defeated. It doesn't prove anything infallibly, but it's some kind of evidence based on what we have seen. And of course, all the typical responses work. Well, we only have one universe, and who knows, and blah, 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 and hamada, hamada. But nonetheless, everything that we've ever seen that's complex in this way has been designed by a mind. Now, maybe it's a bunch of stupid, evil minds. Like I always, could be like one designer for all the flowers, one designer for all the beetles. Or you think about how iPhones were made. The iPhone didn't just spring out all nice and everything. It was like a bunch of shitty iPhones first. So maybe, this is like a shitty version of the world and we're all, I don't know. So anyway, so it doesn't prove like anything like the nature of God or anything like that. I'm not saying, perfect, all powerful, none of that shit. But certainly there is a suggestive analogy between the things we find around us and things which are designed. And so that's evidence for simulation, I would say, that amongst other things, it could also be evidence for something else.
Oh yeah, so the best argument when asked what is the best argument for theism, I think it's the DNA is a code argument. Like DNA is a code. All codes we see are made by a mind. DNA is made by a mind. So that I definitely would count that as evidence when we first initially discovered DNA. This is like, oh, this looks like we've been designed by some kind of a mind. And then so that I would count as evidence. But of course, after that, there were defeaters of, well, the naturalist hypothesis has made testable predictions about here's how RNA forms on clay, here's how corpuscles form on clay, here's how we can do this naturally, all these processes. So that's good evidence for the naturalistic hypothesis of the RNA world, because that has a way to differentiate itself from being imaginary. It's made testable predictions. And so that's really good. And so that has defeated the fine-tuning argument, which was the everything is complex or the DNA is code argument. Those things seem to have been defeated because all that stuff as naturalistic hypotheses, which have made testable predictions, which are better evidence. So I would count like the code argument as evidence in that case. That is what I consider to be the best argument for theism.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I dispute that whether that's fine tuning or not, since I think of fine tuning as sort of more based on fundamental physics and gravitational constant and stuff like that, as opposed to DNA. But so yeah, I guess I don't know. Anyway, so I'm not really disagreeing with you ultimately, but what I'm just trying to put pressure on is what the thing that you call evidence and why I don't have it. Because the reason I'm an agnostic, remember, I'm an atheist about all known religions. But I do think that it's an open question whether there was something transcendent which had a causal influence on our world. And I think there are reasons to believe it, and I think there are reasons not to believe it. So what I hear you saying is that you don't think there are any reasons to believe it, but really what you're saying is you don't accept the reasons to believe it. Not that there aren't any, because I think the simulation hypothesis is a reason to believe it. It can be defeated. It can be over. And there are two defeaters in the argument, actually. The first two, namely that we go extinct, which is the more likely option, or that we lose interest. And so if we're really moral, that's like how I interpret the morality claim you're making, factoring into the Bostrom argument. Because if we really are moral in the way that you think, then there will become a point at which we say, stop simulating. We're creating conscious beings. They're suffering. That's immoral. So stop doing it. And we'll put a moratorium on it and simply, outlaw all future simulations of this kind. So that's why I think the kind of moral claims you're making can be factored into the first two clauses, right? So either we go extinct, or like we give a shit about morality and we stop simulating, or we're in a simulation. So, but notice I think that's evidence that we're in a simulation. I also think it's evidence that we go extinct. I also think it's evidence that we stop simulating. So that's the conclusion of the argument, is one of these three things is the case, or that consciousness is biological, not computational. So anyway, so I guess that I don't have any, I'm just rephrasing it, but I think that does count as evidence. It can be defeated, but you haven't defeated it yet. I mean, you haven't given me any reason to think that the other two things hold. And if they do, then, we don't have evidence for in the simulation. But as of right now, the three options are all equally consistent. And so if that were the case, then all of the traditional things about God would mostly be true, except for maybe the moral stuff. But the outside of time and space, the timelessness, the 13-year-old in their underwear is outside of time and space, of this time and space. The 13-year-old in their underwear is all powerful with respect to the simulation. They can intervene in it and so forth and so on. So it meets all those classical criteria. And so I don't know, Church of the Simulation doesn't seem to me to be very far off.
Yeah, I definitely understand your argument. I would say that it's wrong to just limit it to those three possibilities. I think that we shouldn't be placing those. Those. This is what I can imagine to be the case. Is essentially that argument. Here's what I imagine to be the case. I'm like, yeah, but there could be stuff you just don't imagine, and I don't think we should conclude that your imagination really tells us anything about reality until you get that extra piece of evidence that I'm looking for. Of, well, here, how do you tell me that this is real and not imaginary, not just something you've imagined to be the case? Because maybe it's the case that we are in a simulation, but we all chose to be here voluntarily. Like, we're going to voluntarily enter this world as a simulation, exactly as miserable it is, just to see what it's like. Like, that's a possibility
Right.
too. So there's all kinds of possibilities there, and I don't think it really counts as evidence that we are or are not in the simulation hypothesis, just that some people have imagined it to be the case. Like, I think, okay, that's you have a very nice imagination. That's really cool. I don't think I'm going to count this as evidence it is or isn't the case, because until you can show me that there's something more here in reality than just your imagination. And so that's,
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. By the way, just since you mentioned that, I do think that puts pressure on a different argument of yours, which is that it's kind of immoral of God to create us.
oh yeah. So if God
We don't
created,
really know.
yeah, that's one of the main arguments that I've talked with Thea. Is like, if God created the universe where everything is voluntary, just like I asked it, this exact world is still possible. We just all have to voluntarily choose to enter it and vanish our imaginations.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's like the total recall hypothesis, right? So not the new one, but the good one with Arnold. So in that one, he volunteered to have his memory wiped and take this role. And so, we don't know that, because that was one of the things that I always railed about. I was like, who is this fucker just to put me here and then say, follow my rules or die? I was like, I didn't ask to show up. And by the way, you gave me this gift and I can accept it or tell you to fuck off, because that's how gifts work. And then I was thinking, but I don't really know that I didn't voluntarily accept this. I might have agreed to show up here, and maybe there is a point at which God said, or the creator, the simulator, let's just call him the simulator, because I don't like talking about God, to be honest. Let's just call him the simulator. So the simulator says to you, do you want to go in or not? And you say, yeah, fuck it. I want to know what it's like and it's all, I'll come back, and it's all, just like video game anyway, right? Just VR. So, hey, throw me in there. Just like I played Last of Us 2. I don't really want to be eaten by zombies, but man, it's fun crawling around in those dungeons and being chased around by the zombies, as long as it's all like going to go away at some point. So it's not clear to me that this God is immoral because he threw us here argument really works, unless you're willing to accept that you actually didn't voluntarily show up here, but you don't have any reason to believe that, right? There's no evidence that that's the case.
Right. So that's the caveat of the argument, is like, if God forced us to be here without our consent, then God is immoral. So it's only if the forcing without the consent thing. If it's all consensual, then it's not immoral by my own admission. So I totally grant that.
Yeah. You don't buy the argument that it's impossible for God to, because this is something I always argue with theists about. So I was like, why couldn't God just make everyone always do what's right? Not make us do what's right, but make us so that we do what's right. And the reasoning there is like, okay, there are some things I can't do. Like I can't fly and I can't be Queen of England, but I don't rail about it all the time and say, fuck, I can't be Queen of England. Like, you fucking cruel fate. How come I can't be Queen of England? It's like, yeah, all right. So I just kind of accept that I can't be Queen of England. It's just the way reality is. And if I'm falling to the ground, I can't suddenly say, I wish I weren't falling, and stop falling. So there's something, but I still have free will, right? People, so I can't stop myself from falling to the ground, but I still am able to be free. So why couldn't God have made it the case that raping and murdering were like falling to the ground, right? Just something you can't do, or stopping yourself from falling to the ground, something that you just can't do. But you can still make free choices. It's just, you don't have to give them all the options. So I never really understood why free will requires the ability to do all these heinous things. It requires the ability to make choices. And people say, well, you got to love God and you got to volunteer. So yeah, you could do all that shit too. But it's like, why do I have to be allowed to do all this other stuff? So I never really understood that line about the free will bit. And I do think that that's a big problem in their argument of free will defense. However, so I do think that, could God have made a world that was morally perfect? I say, yeah, easy. He just makes a world where raping is like stopping yourself from falling, but he did not do that. Or makes it where involuntary, to put it in your terms, where he makes it where involuntary imposition of will is just something that is like,
an extra law of physics. That's the argument I use. If he just adds one law of physics where it's physically impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to, then it would be just like the following example. It's like, well, we still have the desire, so the sin is still there. It's not morally perfect given the theist definition, because thought crime is a thing in Christianity.
Exactly.
So it's still immoral. We still have free will, but we can't rape people. And so that would be a better world. God did not create that. Therefore, God is immoral.
Exactly. No, I 100% agree with that argument. So there are people like Plantinga who think that that argument is defeated by his, transworld depravity. Do you know about this crap?
Yeah, that it's
It's
logically impossible for God to do these things because it's against his nature for certain reasons.
it's not against his nature. It's that it's so. I guess you have to take. So Plantinga's idea is that here's the claim that he wants to defeat: that it's logically impossible. That it's logically impossible for God to make a perfect world where everyone always freely chooses to do what's morally good. And so what he wants to show is that God can't do that, that it's not possible. Even though there is a possible world where everyone freely chooses to do what's right, God can't make that the actual world. That's basically Plantinga's idea. And that defeats a very strong form of the argument from evil, which says that, so that's different than this what's so-called inductive argument from evil, which is just like, yeah, but there's so much evil, dude. Like it's just like a lot, like really a lot. And just take evolution. Jeez, man, fuck. Anybody who thinks God created us by evolution, just a sadistic, fucking cruel son of a bitch, in my opinion. Like,
99.99% of all beings died a miserable death thanks to evolution.
Yeah, that's your best you could come up with. I mean, to me, if you're like, that makes more sense about simulation. About like if the 13-year-old is trying to, one way we're trying to do it right now is by evolutionary means. So it makes more sense that it'd be imperfect if that were the case. That's a really flawed method. But anyway, so what Planting wants to show is that there is this problem here, which is that so he says, consider this world where everyone always freely chooses to do what's right. But in that world, they have this problem. It's called transworld depravity, which means that in every other world that they are put in, they'll always do at least one morally bad thing. So there is a world where everybody always freely chooses to do what's right, according to Plantinga. But God cannot make that world the actual world. Because if he did, he would make a contradiction come true. And then you have to also add in that God can't do contradictions, which some people will reject. Like, I don't know why. What? If he wants to make 2 + 9 = 25, like, you're going to stop him? I don't know. So some people think he's constrained by the laws of logic. I think, why think that? Some people say it's in its nature to be constrained by the laws of logic. Okay, good. But so if that's what you think, and that's what Plantinga thinks, by the way, if that's what you think, then it wouldn't be possible for God to make a world like you're describing, because they have this property of transworld depravity. Namely, in any world where they're actualized, they're going to do something morally wrong. And that defeats just the idea that it's sort of contradictory, that the idea of evil is so that's the way like J.L. Mackie in the classic old days is. Like it's literally a contradiction is entailed by these 4 sentences. God is all knowing, all perfect, morally good, and evil exists. And what Plantinga wants to show is that there is no contradiction which is entailed by that.
Right. So he's arguing against the logical problem of evil rather than the evidential. And the whole point of my argument is to try and counter Plantinga. So I want to say, nope, it's logically impossible or close to it, as long as if God doesn't add this extra law of logic or extra law of physics that it's physically impossible to force anyone to do something they don't consent to, then that is a morally inferior world, because the world I'm describing still allows for immorality. Christianity still says if you covet someone else's wife, you've committed a crime or an immoral action. So in this world, immorality is still possible. So you can still just grant, yep, you can still do immorality in this world and still have suffering and have free will. And there's nothing about that is impossible. Especially simulation hypothesis, we can do it. So if we can do it and God can't do it, wait a minute.
Then it's a bad look for God.
Yep. The whole point of my argument is to address Plantinga and say, no, it is logically impossible. I'm going to take the strong route and say it's a logical impossibility as long as it's not consensual.
See, but so you have to challenge the point of the premise there, which is, so he says transworld depravity is defined in a very technical way. No one cares, but I find there's a lot of obfuscation when you use a lot of symbols that way, and he's king of that. So anyway, he defines it in a technical way, but intuitively, go away, Siri, fuck you. Intuitively, all it says is they have a property which is as follows. In any world where they're actualized, they will do something immoral. So you say, yeah, well, they'll have this thought. But it's not clear that that's doing something immoral. And in fact, in Christianity, is widely interpreted. Remember, I'm not a Christian, but anyway, as is widely interpreted, having homosexual thoughts is a sin, but not a mortal sin. But being a homosexual is. So it's like, yeah, it's bad, but it's not. You can, if you just think those thoughts, then you're not as morally culpable as if you do the actions. Maybe it's bad, and coveting is bad, and so forth and so on, but it's not the same as doing it. So you have to be committed to this weaker claim, which is that you can think about it but not do it. Whereas planting is committed to the claim that it is possible that they do it, and it just may be a brute fact about the souls, or what he calls creaturely essences. I hate talking in his language, but anyway, so that's the way he speaks. It's just it may be a brute fact that those things have this property such that they will go wrong, so that he could not have added that extra physical law, because to do so would contravene some deep metaphysical truth, namely that these things will behave in such a way in any world that they were actualized.
Right. I'd say that
you have really addressed his argument, is what I'm saying, as opposed to a different one.
Well, my argument is that it seems like it's possible to have all of the features required to describe the Christian world. So free will, suffering, morality, all the things that Christians say, these are required of a God-based world. God would have to create the things with these properties. Now, Plantinga's added in an extra property that he's added that doesn't seem to be required in classical Christianity or anything. So he just made up this property. Like, well, okay, that's no different from straight up, necessitarianism. Well, everything has to be exactly determined as it is, the way it is, because of this new property you're adding in. So obviously you can add in a new property, but that isn't the point of the argument. The point of the argument is saying it is logically impossible, given the fact that we can have a world with free will and suffering and morality. All of those three things are not logically incompatible. So if you just grant those three things without adding in a new property, then it is a logical argument against the existence of God. Now, obviously, if you add in a new property and say, well, no, God couldn't do anything differently anyway, and instead of going through Plantinga's super convoluted way of just saying the same thing with some kind of randomness feature added into it, it's essentially just, since we don't think God is determined in that sense of way, then all of these things are not contradictory. You can have all of these things in the world without a logical contradiction.
Right. But so Plantinga is arguing in the opposite direction, which is that there's no logical contradiction in there being that extra property. So therefore, there's no logical contradiction in if things turned out that way. So imagine all of modal space. So maybe it's all connected. Maybe this is separated and there's stuff over here. You have different S1, S2, who cares? You have different accessibility relations between worlds. So, whatever. Suppose it's disconnected. It's over there. Okay. So, but there's no logical contradiction there. So therefore, there's no logical contradiction in the idea that God can't create a world where everyone does something morally wrong.
Well, I'd say
they never do something morally wrong. And that's all that Plantinga needs to defeat the logical argument.
Well, I'm saying that would be a logical contradiction with the definition of morality. So if God is perfectly moral, he could not create that world. The fact that he can create this world means he's not perfectly moral. Or that there's a better world out there, and he can't create that better world.
But hold on. I understand what you're saying. I totally get it. And I don't want to defend Plantinga too much, but for the sake of the argument, the point that he's making is there's no contradiction in this idea that all the souls have transworld depravity. If that's the case, then there's no contradiction in the idea that God could not make a world where everyone freely chooses to do what's morally right, because the property of being transworld deprived guarantees that you'll go wrong with in at least one action. So you say that's an extra property, and Plantinga says, yeah, okay, but what's the contradiction in adding that extra property? Because all he's trying to show is that it's not, that there's no, so the people like me who want to come and say, there's a contradiction here. Like, it's literally a contradiction. You're saying something that either he's not all powerful, or he doesn't know how to do it, or he's not perfectly moral, or that there is no evil. All four of those things cannot be true. It's necessarily the case that those four things can't be true. And what Plantinga is doing is saying, no, here's a possible way things could be where all four of those things are true. So that defeats the argument. And then you can add a bunch of bells and whistles or whatever you want, but that's all that he needs to show that the logical problem of evil can be answered. If there's one possible way, doesn't have to be even actual, just possible. If there's one possible way of describing things where God is all-knowing, all-powerful, morally good, and can't make a world where there's no evil, then the argument from evil is in trouble.
Right. So my argument is that he can all of the features about people can be made the same. So he changes absolutely nothing about people, but he can change the physical state of the environment. And so since that doesn't in any way affect the morality,
Contradiction.
what
Doing that would entail a contradiction, so we can't do that.
what do you mean? So if you can't change the physical environment?
Yes. In that situation, you can't change the physical environment without producing a contradiction. If the creatures have, if the souls have transworld depravity, then they must go wrong with respect to at least one action. Therefore, he can't make the laws of physics such that they can't go wrong because they will have gone wrong and not gone wrong with respect to a certain action. Hence, a contradiction.
Well, it seems obviously wrong. I mean, saying that you can't change the environment without changing the people, like he could make Mars disappear just fine without affecting anybody. So it doesn't seem like that is the case. That seems just obviously false.
If in this, so we're imagining, so that's why I said put all those possible worlds over there, so that they're not connected to our space of whatever modality, however you want to put it. So it's not, maybe it's not even a way our world could be. So remember, this is purely like there is a possibility here. And the possibility is that that the souls just are by their nature transworld deprived, such that however they get instantiated, they will go wrong with respect to at least one action. So he cannot make a world where they don't go wrong with respect to one action, because that's the way their nature is, that they will go wrong. That's just how they are. So if he made a law where they didn't go wrong, then he would be making it the case, by putting that creature in that world, he'd be making it the case that they can and can't go wrong. Hence contradiction.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So it seems like saying that any possible change God could make is a logical contradiction just is necessitarianism.
Change. It's any. So remember, we're stipulating that in this possible world, the creatures have this transworld property, such that just by their nature, the way they are, they have the property that anywhere they're put, they will make a moral mistake. They will go wrong with respect to one action. So that it would be impossible to put that creature in a world where it didn't commit an immoral act.
Again,
Just because
that doesn't seem to make sense. So like Stephen Hawking, paraplegic, someone's born paraplegic or born and dies immediately. They obviously didn't have time to commit an immoral act. So it doesn't seem to make any sense to say they're necessarily going to commit an immoral act in any world they're put into. If he's saying that if they're put into all possible worlds, what?
So that's just a stipulation. So so he makes up the property. So this is the added feature. Says there is a property here. I'll define it. The property is called transworld depravity, and it is this: any world that you find yourself in, you will go wrong to with at least one action. So he gives a couple, like, so I create you over here and you take a bribe. I put you in a different situation and you don't take a bribe, but you lie to your best friend about something. I put you in a different situation and you don't do that, but you steal $5 from your roommate. So that there's no way in which I can make you in such a way that you didn't do something that was immoral.
Right. So if I can give one example,
world depravity, so that you can't make it so that they don't do that. Otherwise, you're. So it's like saying like, so imagine it as false. So suppose you believe that the number 7 is prime necessarily, so that you can't just change the laws of physics so that the number 7 is even, because it contradicts the nature of the number 7. So if you believe, by the way, this is a big assumption. If you believe God is limited by the laws of logic, which, I don't find a lot of reasons to accept, but some people do, then God cannot make the number 7 even. And so now why? Because the number 7 in its essence is prime. So also in the same way, according to Planting, the property of transworld depravity is a property that these souls have essentially, like the number 7 has the primeness essentially. So we can't put it in a world where it's even, and you can't put this soul in a world where it always does what's right.
So if transworld depravity is a property of a person and not a property of the nature, then it should be possible to change the nature without changing the person, like changing physics or whatever. So it seems like there's a logical contradiction in the property of itself of transworld depravity, that if you would be in a world and not commit a sin, but the same person could be in a different world and commit the sin. And so there's always going to be some way you're going to commit a sin. Well, then that's not you. Those are different people now. So if there's...
So this is why you have to buy all of this like crap about creaturely essences, which are like, haxaities or a primitive thisness. I mean, there's all kinds of stupid words that these people use. But basically what they're trying to pick out is there's something which really is you. That's what you are. What makes you you is this essence thing. And God has all of these essence things, and he can put them in different worlds. But it may be the case that these essence things are depraved in this way, so that no matter where you put them, they do this. So it would be the same person by Plantinga's definition of person.
That still doesn't seem to be a contradiction between placing me in a world where I'm paraplegic and physically can't do anything. So that's clearly a logical possibility. And saying it's logically impossible for God to make me a paraplegic because then I can't do an evil sin or whatever is ridiculous. That's just like use it.
Well, Hawking can still lie. He can still cheat on his wife. He can still fabricate data. So even if he's quadriplegic, by the way, even if he's quadriplegic, it doesn't. So all it means is that you will do something immoral. You'll impose on someone's will in your view. So, paraplegics, quadriplegics, they can do that too.
Well, in my world, those aren't immoral. Those are perfectly fine. So I'm okay with lying. That's not immoral because it's not an involuntary imposition of will in that sense. So I think...
Oh, yes, it is.
I would disagree.
Holy.
I think lying is pragmatic. So I think that if we lived in the best of all possible worlds where it's physically impossible to force anyone, like physically, so not lying isn't the physical force of any kind. If it's physically impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to, and you're essentially a god in your own universe, so nothing can hurt you, then it doesn't matter if people lie to you anymore. It's really not a big deal. It's kind of just a pragmatic thing.
Yeah, I guess I disagree with that. I don't want to get too distracted, but I think that the imposition of the will comes on the fact that you are manipulating me and my reason, treating me sort of like an ATM machine where if you punch the right code in to get me to do the right thing, that seems like a huge imposition on my will. Because, if I want to do X, but you lie to me and give me reason not to do X, and then I decide not to do X based on that reason, you've definitely imposed on my will because I wanted to do X. But because of your lie, I think I shouldn't do X. And so I don't. And that seems to me to be super thwarting my will as a rational agent, as a person who plans things and tries to figure out how to accomplish them.
That's why I said it's pragmatic, because I think that only applies if you're the god of your universe, you know everything in your universe, you have all power over your universe, and they're trying to convince you to not do something. I mean, they're not going to be able to manipulate you in that way. It's your universe. So the only reason that lying is a problem is because it has an impact on your limited capabilities in this universe. Like if you were God, then who cares if people lie to you? Like I already know that that's the ball is in that box and not that box. Like what are you doing?
I see what you're saying, but let me ask. I guess I don't want to keep you forever. I mean, I feel bad already.
No, this is great. I get paid money for this, so I'm good.
Okay, cool then. I'm supposed to go play Mario Kart with my son at some point, so I can't be doing this forever.
Oh yeah, but, just to respond to the Plantinga thing. So to say that it's logically impossible to change the world without changing the person seems to be like a logical contradiction. Because again, if the paraplegic in that example, in my world, everything he can do, he can lie, he can cheat on his wife, he can do all that stuff. That's not immoral. That's perfectly fine. So my world allows for all of that. The only thing it doesn't allow for is the physical harm. So the rape, murder, guns, those kinds of things. But everything else, all of the sin, all of the cheating, lying, stealing, all of that is allowed in my world. So it seems like if my world is the case, all of the sins that Plantinga wants to say could happen. My world has that, and it just doesn't have all the rape and murder and stuff.
Yeah. So when you say, you're limiting at just physical harm.
Yep. Involuntary physical harm. Still possible if you allow it. So that's another thing. Even if you allow someone to hurt you, it's still possible to do that too.
On your view, is it the case that trying to impose on someone's will but failing is immoral?
No.
Okay, so it has to actually be an imposition.
Yep. So like I could try to impose on God's will all I want, not going to do a thing. Not going to have no effect. Like the ant can try to impose on my will all it wants. He can have fun with that. Totally fine.
No, what I meant was like, suppose I try to murder you but fail. So I load a gun with bullets that I don't know are blanks, and then I show up at your house and shoot you in the face with a blank, and you don't die. So and maybe nothing even happened. I'm far enough away that nothing would happen. So therefore, have I done anything wrong?
Again, since my view of morality goes from the perspective of this best of all possible worlds, if we're in that best of all possible worlds, you loading a gun is like you being the ant. Like it's literally, you couldn't do anything unless I allowed it in the first place. So
Right.
because I define morality from the perspective of the best of all possible worlds, where it's already physically impossible to do anything, no, your intention could never do anything anyway. The only reason it's a concern here is because your intention could lead to actions that could actually do something to me, and so we have to pragmatically treat it as an issue. But if we lived in the best of all possible worlds, you can intend all you want, don't even have to worry about it. It's not going to make a thing. So it's not actually objectively immoral in all possible worlds. It's only pragmatically immoral in this world because those intentions could lead to actual things that have actual consequences.
Yeah, no, okay, I see. But I think that you have run into a problem, into the danger of talking past your opponent, because I think a lot of the things that you're going to say are pragmatic or whatever. They're going to say, no, those are just straight immoral. And so those are the sorts of things which they think. So you're going to say, look, God could allow this. And they're going to say, whoa, but that's, you're doing things that are immoral there. And you're saying, no, not really, just pragmatic or whatever.
No, I would just grant, it's like, yep, yes, you can do that. And it is immoral, but it's still possible under this world. And this world is morally better. Therefore, God is impossible. So I would just grant, in the case of the theistic argument, I would grant, yes, you can do those things and they are immoral. So you can still have all the immorality that Plantinga wants and still have a better world.
Yeah, but then you run into the transworld depravity argument. So so he can't make it the case that you create a world where no one lies, let's say, and you say, well, I don't really care, but I do actually care about that. I would like to live in a world where no one lies, and I don't like feeling manipulated or even people trying to manipulate. I don't know. It's like I'm a teacher, as I've said already, and when students come to me and they try to lie to me about I couldn't do the work for this reason or whatever, it doesn't really affect me, but it offends me, and I feel like it's immoral that they're doing that, and I don't like being manipulated or misled, or taken advantage of, or being played for a sucker or anything like that. So to me, that seems like immoral. Like you're not respecting me as an agent, as a person with tell me the truth, let me make my decision. Don't try to manipulate me into the decision which you would like to have. And you're saying, well, that's just pragmatic because, they can't, but I don't really care about that because they can't harm me. Like they're not doing any harm to me, but they're violating my autonomy. In the way I think of the word autonomy, they're trying to impose their will on mine, by telling me certain things to get me to believe certain things so that I will act in certain ways, which I wouldn't possibly act. That seems like they are imposing on my will. Now I get that you're using it in a more narrowly defined way. Like, you actually have to, I don't want you to eat me, sir, but I'm going to chop off your arm and eat you. Damn it, impose on my will. Whereas I have a more kind of wide ranging definition, or a broader notion of what it means to impose on involuntary imposition of will. I think that even in the case of lying, you're doing it. And accepting a bribe, stealing from someone, I think you're imposing. So yeah, I guess that's a case for a
well, just because I was specifically responding to Plantingas, it is possible for lying to be immoral in my world, in my best of all possible worlds. Like if you and another person agree to be in a cohabitable relationship in a universe, and you set up a set of rules that do not lie, lying is immoral in that world, then yes, it would be immoral because it would be against. You have written the laws that this is your will in this world, and if breaking that would be immoral. So it definitely can be in my best of all possible worlds. Lying can be immoral if you set up the laws in your cohabitable relationship to set that be one of the laws, for sure. But
yeah, but why do you need to set it up? Because I think already in the pursuits of science, we assume truth telling as an important thing, and as I already said, as a rational agent trying to make plans about the future, it's important to have correct information. So I think we already have that agreement. It's just implicit right now. It's encoded in the very idea of being an agent who chooses to do things as opposed to do other things. I mean, so, I think slavery is bad, but I don't think having an ox pull a plow is bad. All things considered, maybe the ox would be happier doing something else, but I don't really feel like I'm thwarting the plans of the ox. So I don't feel like the ox is thinking to itself, this motherfucker, I would rather be at school, or I'd rather be playing Nintendo Switch, or I've got a book that I would rather be reading, or I have my own goals that I'm trying to pursue. Whereas if you take a human being and enslave them, then you are thwarting. So that's part of what's bad about, it's not the only thing, obviously, but that's part of what's bad about slavery, is that you're imposing your will on that person. And the reason that is bad is because they would rather be doing something else. They have their own projects that they'd rather pursue, but the ox doesn't. The ox doesn't care. Presumably, right? Exactly. No, it's an open question, but I think we have reason to believe the ox doesn't care.
Oh yeah, and I totally agree. I'd say that
plow all day, being dad, rather be out in the field, but I don't even think they have those concepts, or I really don't think that. So anyway, I think it's maybe I'm more of a Kantian in this way than you are. So I think that the idea of being a rational agent already. So in order for me to treat you as a moral agent, I have to think of you as a rational agent who has their own goals. And I ought not to stand in the way of those without good reason. That's what imposition of will means. It means you should be allowed to determine what you do, which projects you think are valuable, how you pursue them. And if you want to go and eat popcorn all day and drop out of school and stare at the corner, and count to alpha knots in your remaining years, I'll say that's a waste of time. I wouldn't do it, but I'm not going to go over there and tell you not to do it. Or try to lie to you to convince you that you should do. So anyway, I just think that I think that in the kinds of cases we're considering here, planting is going to really kind of insist. So stealing should count as immoral. Like God, if God makes a world where nobody goes wrong, then He should make a world where everyone's always telling the truth. No one is stealing. No one is harming anybody. No one's killing. No one's raping. But all these other things should be there as well. I think that if you allow those, then you don't really have a case that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Oh, right. So
world just like that where they don't lie.
Right. So those would be two different things. I would just grant Plantinga's definition of morality and say, yep, all of those things are immoral. God could have done it this way and added this one physical law that would have been more moral. So that world's better than this world. And that would be sufficient. And then my own moral system would be a separate issue to that, where I don't actually think those are immoral, but that would be a different topic than just addressing Plantinga's argument, which I'd say, yep, I can just grant those are immoral and we can allow them in the universe I've described. Therefore, your argument's defeated.
Yeah, but so I don't think it is defeated. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't think it is defeated because you haven't really shown why the transworld depravity scenario is contradictory. What's the contradiction there?
Well, in that case, I would grant it for the case of like we can have give everyone transworld depravity. We can give everyone their universe, but there's the ones that they don't allow are the ones with the rape and the murder and the physical imposition. Those don't allowed, but we can still have the transworld depravity. Everyone still has that. We still have it. We still have all of those properties. So it's still possible to have a universe with that property and no rape.
Right. No, I think Plantinga agrees with that though. But then he would say, well, there'd be still something immoral there. And so therefore God didn't create a world where everyone freely chooses to do what's right because they're still lying and cheating and stealing, and that's immoral.
Right. So I'm only, if there can be a world without rape and there isn't a world without rape, then God created this world with rape. God's immoral. Like we could have created the one without rape. He just like, not the rape ones. We'll get rid of the rape ones and just all the other stuff is fine. Just not.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, but you're still not addressing the argument though. So I'm on board with you, by the way. Yes, I agree that, but that's not the logical problem of evil. The logical problem of evil just says, is it a contradiction that these four things are true? There is something immoral, and God has all these properties. And Plantinga says, no, here's a scenario where all those things are true. So no contradiction.
Right.
So you just granted him that. So therefore what you're appealing to is the evidential argument, which says the kind or type of evil which exists suggests that God doesn't exist, not that there's a logical contradiction between these properties.
Right. I would less for specific evils. I'd say it's a logical impossibility for God to allow rape and be all good. And so other evils, we can have all those other evils. Like, yes, we'll grant the transworld identity. Yes, lying, we can have that. That's fine. But the rape one, no. That one is what's logically impossible. So it's like the gratuitous evil. Right,
the gratuitous evil, right? That's the stuff that's logically impossible. Yeah, I think that's a good point, actually. I think I have to agree with you on that. I mean, obviously, I'm playing devil's advocate here anyway, so I did agree with you. But
Richard's a closet theist. We can send it.
No, damn it, no.
I'm going to send this to Plantinga. He's going to send you a nice little email and say, "Oh, I'm so proud of you. You've converted to Christianity."
Oh, Alvin, no, thank you. He's a nice guy, by the way. I don't have anything against him personally, but I do think that, his arguments don't succeed. So that's very interesting. I like that point of view, actually. So you have to reconfigure the argument from evil a little bit and say, look, here are the inconsistent premises, that there's this kind of evil, and these other things. But yeah, I don't think that that's a logic. Yeah. Anyway, so I gotta shut up.
That's where the logical part comes in, is because when you look at it from my perspective, the only things I'm omitting are the actual evils, or the actual immorals from my definition. And so in my definition, we can allow all Plantinga's evils, all those lying and stuff. Granted, you can have all those. So it's a logical problem based off of my definition of evil. And that's why I reject his, that's why I adopt the logical point from my definition of what morality is. And I can grant his immorality. It's like, you want lying? Keep it. I'm okay with that. You can have that. Go for it. Transcendental evil stuff, go for it. Lying, fine.
Yeah, it's not clear to me, though, that you can't just modify, now that I'm thinking about it, you can't just modify his argument and say, look, here's trans world depravity 2.0. They have the property such that they will commit some gratuitous evil in any situation that they find themselves in. There's no contradiction that they have that property.
Well, that's where I go to the paraplegic argument. A paraplegic obviously can't rape anybody. It's not physically possible. So creating, it's obviously
an argument that you couldn't create paraplegics in this possible world.
Right, but there are paraplegics.
Right, but we're only talking about what's possible, not what's actual. So remember, planting out, having these four statements come out, that's all he cares about. Is there any way at all, metaphysically, logically speaking, that these four propositions can be true? If so, logical problem of evil defeated, evidential problem of evil, different story. So here's a possible way that so he couldn't create paraplegics in that world. Okay.
Well, I'd say that kind of disproves his argument. So I'd say it's a logical contradiction for a God who is perfectly good to create a possible world which allows rape. If there was a perfectly morally good God, it would never allow for that possibility. You can still have all the evils. You still have the transcendental evil stuff that Plantinga wants, but not that one. That one can't be the case, because that would be a definite contradiction.
But why can't you stipulate that they have this property where they're going to, no matter what? So that if he creates anyone, there's going to be at least one act.
Because it's not a property of them; it's a property of the world. Like to create
property of them.
Well, no, that's the thing. It's like there has to be a medium of them, some kind of interaction with the world to the other person, which means you can keep any property of them you want. You can just keep Hitler, put Hitler in every possible universe. If whatever properties Hitler has is the same in all possible universes, but the physical properties of the universe can be different such that the actions Hitler can take are going to be different.
Right.
So no matter what properties you add to the person, there will always be the same, but you can change the environment so his actions can be different. So that's the sticking point, is that God could give everybody whatever properties Plantinga wants to have, but he can change the environment. Those are two separate things. So it's not logically possible.
He can't change the environment every way. Like, he can't make the environment such that the number 7 is even, according to Plantinga. Remember, I don't agree with him, but that's his view. So if there's something about the nature of these things such that, now I don't know, to me, so if I were responding to this argument, I'd say, well, why would he create anything at all under those situations? He should abstain from, if this were really the way things were, such that he could not create these creatures without some gratuitous evil being instantiated, then he's morally perfect, then he's under an obligation not to create anybody. He should just be alone forever. Fuck him. Like, why bring us into it? And I don't think that, he has he says he was lonely. He wants to be loved, and he wants us to admire his creation. Well, fuck, I don't give a shit. Like, so I would take a different approach so I'm not saying I agree with the argument. What I'm saying is that it seems like the way you're presenting the argument begs the question against Plantinga, by saying, look, he could have made the situation different. So
there's one more step. So just to interrupt for a second.
Go ahead.
If you're going to say it's logically impossible to change the environment without changing the person, and then we can do it in this world, like by creating a simulation or uploading brains or whatever, simulation hypothesis, if we can do it, that's where it leads to the problem of God can't do this, even if we can do it. So if you can get Plantinga to admit that it's logically impossible to create a world with paraplegics, or to change the physical laws to make it so it's not possible for a person to rape, and then we can do it, that debunks his God completely. Like, well, then we're more powerful than your God, you're done. essentially.
Yeah, I love that, but it's not. I don't think it's accurate though, because remember, all that Planting is not talking about the actual world, or he doesn't give a shit about the actual world. This argument has nothing to do with the actual world. It's like erase the actual world. The actual world, just like exit, erase it, move it over there. It's not relevant to the arguments. The reason being is that that's why I said put these space of possible worlds over there. Maybe there's no accessibility relation between us and them. So therefore, these could never be the way our world is, let's say, possibly. That's all that we're trying to do, is describe a scenario where the four claims are true, that God, all-powerful, all-knowing, morally good, and evil exists, and there's no contradiction. And by evil, we'll define gratuitous evil. So if it's that, so you can't disprove that argument by talking about something about our actual world, right? You can't do that, because this is a separate possible world that doesn't interact with our world.
So what if I limit it and just say it's impossible to have gratuitous evil in the actual world? That would be a logical contradiction.
Well, what's the logical contradiction?
That if there was an all-powerful God, he would create a world without this gratuitous evil. So he can't be all good and create an actual world with gratuitous evil.
But we just gave an argument that he could, though.
What do you mean? So I just said if in the possible world, but he couldn't actually make it an actual world. That would be the argument. So if it's a possible world he could create, like it's logically possible, like he could create a world with round squares or 2+7 or whatever. That doesn't matter if it would only, because that wouldn't be immoral based off of most people's view. Just it's possible to create immorality. It would be immoral to create an actual world. This is the case. So wouldn't that be different in the case that, okay, so we can grant there's a possible world maybe, but if it's not, it's impossible for him to do it in the actual world.
Yeah. So, but that's, again, you're changing the topic a little bit, I'd say, because the Planting's aim in this is really quite minimal. He just wants to show that there is a possible way that these four things could be true. And because the logical problem of evil says there is no possible way. So, I mean, it's a really strong claim. It says it is not possible, like logically impossible for there to be any way that you could have all four of these things be true. And Planting says, here's a way that all four things could be true. Now, does it tell us about the actual world? I don't know. It's just a possible way things could be, which these four things would be true. So therefore, in general, there is no contradiction between these four things being true. So and then it's a question why there's evil in the actual world. That's the evidential problem. So I think that's the way Planting would respond to the challenge you're raising, at least.
Well, I think about it like the round square example. Like if you're using Euclidean geometry, it's impossible to have a round square. But if you're using non-Euclidean geometry, of course you can have a round square. That's fine. But in the case of the problem of evil, we're talking about the actual world. Like we don't care about what's maybe there's a possible world where you could allow some evil, like lying and stuff. But the gratuitous evil of rape and stuff in this world, in the actual world, the Euclidean geometry, that would be logically contradictory to an all good being who is all powerful. And so we can just forget about the possible world. I don't care about that. Is it possible for an all good, all powerful God to create this world with rape unconsensually? No. That I would say is a logical contradiction.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's a logical contradiction as opposed to just evidence that there isn't such a being. So that's the difference between logic and the evidential argument. So I'm not sure what the logical contradiction is. I get what you're saying. I totally understand that you're saying if we assume like Euclidean geometry, then certain things are contradictory within Euclidean geometry, even if they're not contradictory within the whole scope of things. And so maybe the actual physical world is like living in a Euclidean geometry world, but given the way it is, some things will be contradictory and some things won't be contradictory. I mean, that's the basic idea of the argument, right?
Yep.
But what's the contradiction?
That an all good, all powerful being, by definition, would create a world with the least evil necessary. This evil is not necessary. Therefore, he did not create the world with the least evil necessary. So he would not be perfectly good.
Yeah. So I think you need some evidence for the first premise that he would create the world with the least evil.
I would just call that by definition morally perfect as a being who would create the world with the least evil. Would that not fit the definitions of morally perfect?
It doesn't. So you have to create the world with the least evil that also doesn't get rid of something that's equally valuable. So you could allow some evil if something more valuable were in place or required for that. So, yeah, but I like what you're saying. I mean, I want to agree with you. Notice I do want. I'm
Oh yeah,
not.
absolutely. We're agreeing on all the evidential stuff. We're totally on board. I'm just taking the
Uh,
stronger position, and you have absolutely good justifications to argue against that. And because it is a very hard position to defend, which is why it's not accepted by the majority. And so I'm going out on a huge limb trying to defend it because I like to. It's a fun
I think you're doing a
philosophical
great job,
experiment.
actually. Yeah, I think you're doing a good job.
Thank you.
So, I'm not sure that you get contradiction there because then you get all this fucking theodicy crap, right? You say, no, soul making and fucking virtues and all that.
Free
I mean, I don't.
will.
Yeah, well, free will is that's the thing that you don't want to eliminate, right?
Yeah.
So, but of course, you know, Mackey really put this the best way. I think he said, "Look, God could have made a world where there's free will and everyone does good. It's called compatibilism, dumbasses. Like, it's like we have free will, but we're determined to act moral. Like, just fucking what?" And some religions actually accept that. Like, as far as some interpretations of Islam, I actually do think that they believe in compatibilism. That God already knows for each creature what they'll do, and it's already written in the book. Every fucking action that they'll do, I think that they do, and
Calvinism.
and yeah, exactly. Calvinism, Anselm, all those guys. So compatibilism is a view here. And if you accept compatibilism, then the argument just goes straight through. God's a jerk. However, if you accept libertarian free will, then it's not so clear that you get the argument in that way. Although then again, so that's my sort of, I agree with you about the physical law. Why couldn't you just make, raping sort of like you can't breathe underwater? It's just a law of nature that these things can't happen. So I like that approach of yours. And that's something I've defended in my I have a blog called Philosophy Sucks where I write a lot about this. And that was one of my, I actually had a debate with a
Love the
religious
title.
guy. Thank you. Yes, it's true too. There's this guy, he's on the East Coast. His name is John Rankin. He has this thing he calls the Mars Hill forums where he debates, non-believers or whatever. And I was one of the guys that he debated. And the question was, if there's God, why is there free will? If there's a God, why is there evil? And basically, I made this argument. This was like back in 2003 or something. I was like, okay, so God could have made us so that, raping was like stopping yourself from falling. It's pretty easy for him to do. And the response that you get from these people is like, well, that's not real free will. Like, if you can't choose, Plantinga makes this response too. If you can't choose to rape, then you really don't have something worth calling free will. I don't think that's very plausible at all.
Like what you said earlier, saying I can't choose to fly whenever I want. Why couldn't rape just be the same?
Yeah. So I think what Planting, and this is why I think your approach is interesting, because what Planting tries to do is say, look, by free will, we don't just mean choosing to do something. What we mean is that you have morally significant options. That's the way he phrased it, right? The options have to be morally significant. So that means that in order to really have like a valuable kind of free will, I have to be able to choose to murder you or not. And so the only reason why like I'm really a good person is because every second I'm around you, I am choosing not to murder you. Like, I'm choosing not to murder you. I'm choosing not to murder you. It's just, that's the only, if it were like not an option, then I just wouldn't really have a free will that was like valuable or something. And to be honest, I never fucking understood that. Or even if you do, so suppose I want to choose to murder you and I jump up with a knife and try to stab you and the knife turns to marshmallow. I don't know. That seems like a law of physics. Like, why couldn't that? And I could still even, go through the action. It just doesn't really affect you in the right way. So I think there's all sorts of problems with this way of redefining free will, the way of thinking that there's more to it than is really there. So just to put my cards on the table, so that we are actually in agreement. I am just playing devil's advocate here, and trying to give you a run for your money. But I really am like convinced by what you're saying. I think it's accurate. I think it's true. But I still think there's an open question about that notion of free will. Like, why do they think that? What is it that is driving people like Plantinga and his cohort to say, if you don't have the option of murdering, then you don't really have free will, even if you could choose all sorts of other things, right? I choose green tea over black tea. I choose this shirt over the other shirt. I'm making choices all over the place and they're free as fuck, but I can't choose to murder you. And they say, well, that's not free will worth having. And I really struggle to sort of understand what it is, why they're saying that. But I do think that that's where the crux of the issue is, and trying to understand why they think that is really the key to the whole issue.
Oh yeah, I think it's just, that's what makes their God sound reasonable. So that's why it's so important. But I would say
Yeah.
they would need to show that free will is actually possible first. Like I don't think free will is logically possible. I think it's either determined for reasons or done for no reason, and so it's either determined or random. Which one is free? How do you get free by adding these together? Like I don't even see free will as logically possible. So I don't know how that could even be an answer. But if they could give that, then maybe they would have an argument compelling for me.
Yeah. Oh, really? So you don't think that the very concept of free will makes
Yeah,
sense?
the libertarian kind, compatibilism, totally fine with, but the libertarian, like, what does that even mean? Like, how can you make a decision that isn't done for reasons? It seems like they're going to be determined by the reasons, or if it's not determined by any reasons, then it's by definition random. It's determined by no reasons.
Yeah, but the
Which,
idea is just that the reasons are considerations, but they don't determine the action. So
all
there
right.
has to
So,
be a
so if you take the final action, the action of deciding, like saying I want to choose 50% chocolate, 50% vanilla, how did I make the choice? What is the thing that does the choosing? Well, is that determined by some reason, or is it completely random, like just an electrical thing firing back and forth? Like, what causes it to go somewhere rather than somewhere else? Is it determined or is it random? Is it some third ontology we haven't discovered yet? What could make that logically possible? Because I don't see anything that can.
Interesting. Yeah. I guess I'm more, I mean, I'm a closet libertarian. You know, I don't want to believe in libertarianism, but I sort of can't help it. Um, but mostly for phenomenological reasons. So I just feel like there are moments, you know, where I'm poised on the precipice and I could go either way. You know, I remember when I was young and I was, you know, I ran away from home and I was on my own. And I didn't have any money, and there was a restaurant, and I could see through the window that all these dollar bills were pinned to the ceiling. And I was standing there with a rock, and I was thinking, I'm gonna bust in there and take this fucking money. Like I have to. And I was like, but should I? But what else am I gonna do? Like I really felt like there was a moment where I could walk away, put the rock down, or I could throw the rock through the window. Now that may be wrong because we had this whole discussion about whether experience is evidence and all that sort of. But it really seems to be that's the only serious reason for taking libertarian free will seriously is that we have these sort of phenomenological experiences whereby it seems like we could choose. Like it really felt to me like I'm going to put the rock down. No, I'm going to throw the rock. Now what should I do? I threw the rock. I took the money. By the way, I felt really bad because it had all kinds of good luck shit written on it. It was like congratulations. And I was like, oh fuck. But it was like I really felt like that. So you know, that was wrong, by the way. I'm not saying that was right. That was 14. I was in a desperate situation. I mean, I ran away from home because my mom said you're going to get baptized. And I was like, hell no, that's not going to happen. So that's a different story. But anyway, so there are moments like that where it really feels like that we have the capacity to go either way. And insofar as I think that experience does give us a kind of defeasible evidence, then, you know, maybe, I mean, anyway, so if I were going to be a determinist, I'd be a hard determinist because I think compatibilism is kind of trying to have your cake and eat it too. And I don't really like compatibilism. But that's why
I agree completely.
I want to believe in libertarian free will, but only because of that kind of experience. So it does seem to me that it does make sense to say, well, there's a possible situation, a possible world where there's kind of these reasons and you're thinking, what this is good and that, but of this, and then you make a choice as between which way to go, and the choice is undetermined by anything. I don't think I don't think there's anything incoherent about that.
Yeah,
But
from
yeah.
my perspective, the way I grew up, I usually treated every decision kind of like, would you rather be shot or stabbed? It's kind of like more pain or less pain. Like I've already determined I'm going to pick the less pain. There is no option here, and I'm just trying to figure out which one is the less pain. So from my perspective, choices are already made. Like I'm determined. I'm picking that one. I'm definitely 100% picking that one, and then I'm just trying to figure out which one that one is. And so I've never really felt that sensation of free will in my life. I've had major depression my entire life, so never felt like there are free choices. It's always been like, I'm drowning, get to the surface fast as possible. Everything's already chosen. But I do feel like I try to figure out which one of those is the one of the less pain. So I'm thinking about which one will add up to less pain, but I feel like my decision is already determined by whichever one my brain figures out has less or more to the best of its ability. So I've never felt the freedom as much as most people.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, yeah, that's why I think these kind of experiential things counts as evidence for me because I've experienced it. Maybe not for you because you haven't. But yeah, I have the opposite experience. I mean, a lot of my actions do feel that way, but I think that there are special cases where you feel like you're poised on the precipice. But if you don't have that experience, then yeah, I don't think you have much reason to believe in free will. I think that's the only reason to believe it. Because I think you can get moral responsibility, all that stuff with determinism. It's like a lot of people say, without free will, you can't have morality. Yeah, you can actually. It's actually pretty simple. You can't have moral responsibility. Yes, you can. In fact, I even defend, kind of Kantian compatibilism. Like, even Kant could have determinism, and still you could be a Kantian. Like,
well, what do you mean by Kantian? Because I remember Kant, categorical imperative. Wasn't he religious pretty thoroughly?
Yeah, he was deeply religious. But so the categorical imperative basically says, well, it depends on which version of the categorical imperative you have, but act on that maxim which you will as a universal law. So I think that could be the correct theory of morality, even in a world where determinism was true.
So you hold to that version, not the religious version that he was more.
What's the religious version?
I just think he used it in order to try and get his religious dogma a little bit. Like he tried to say, well, that's categorical imperative related to God in some way, probably.
Oh no. Kant is that you got to give him more credit than that. He's not a jerk off like Berkeley or Descartes, who brings God in to solve their metaphysical problems. Descartes like, gee, how do I know I'm not in a simulation? Oh, I know God's not a jerk. Aha, fuck, I'm done. Metaphysics solved. Kant criticized that pretty voraciously. He said that's BS. In fact, what Kant thought was that God was like a regulatory idea that but he actually thought you could never give any rational reason to believe in the existence of God. He said every argument for can be matched by an argument against, and he goes through the cosmological argument. There could be a first cause, or it could be an infinite series of causes. Boom, it's stalemate. He goes through every argument and says no. That's called the paralogisms of free reason and critique, by the way. But in those cases, he said, look, there can't be no rational reason to believe in God. God is not the sort of thing which you have rational reasons to believe in. Instead, what he argues is that it's a regulatory principle. Namely, we need it to make sense of the way we think of ourselves. That's the moral argument that he gives, that in order to understand myself as a moral agent who cares about morality, I have to believe in something that's ordering the world and punishing those who deserve it. And otherwise, I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing. Like, why should I care about morality on a deep, deep level? So he was religious, but I don't think he tried to use the categorical imperative. Except in that way that I guess I just said. So in a way, you're slightly right, because the categorical imperative, if that's the correct theory of morality, then Kant thinks you need something that makes sense of why it is that we're not bound by it, because he thinks that's just reason. Like, we're bound by it because it's contradictory to deny it. It's literally a contradiction, according to him, to deny the categorical imperative, because if I want to deny that about you, then I can't think of myself in that way. But obviously, I'm bound in thinking myself as an agent that should be let to do what I want to do, and you can't impose on me. So if I don't think of you in that way, and we're the same in this respect, then I'm contradicting myself. I'm saying free agents shouldn't be treated freely, but you better fucking treat me freely. And that's a contradiction. So I don't think he uses the categorical imperative to get to God. So I don't think it's religious in that way at all. I think it's a separate argument that he has that says, if morality requires you to sacrifice yourself, then why would you choose to sacrifice yourself? Well, morality tells you to, but does that make sense rationally to do that, to give up your interest for something greater? Well, only if, and that part I don't buy, because I think, no, it's logically contradictory not to sacrifice yourself in the consideration that we're considering, if it's moral. So you do have a reason to do it, and we don't need God to make sense of that. I don't want to act immorally because I don't want to be irrational, and I consider myself at my fundamentally a rational agent. So that's sort of bound up in my conception of myself as a person who chooses pragmatically, I want to do this. How do I get there? I got to go here. I got to get up at this time. So that's just what we are. So I don't think you need God and in this way. So I don't think the categorical imperative has anything to do with religion. I think it basically just says to act immorally is to act irrationally.
Well, would he not classify that as a hypothetical imperative? Like, I am a moral agent. In order to act morally, I need to do X, Y, Z. Would that not fit the hypothetical imperative by his definition?
Yeah, that's it. So it's not that's not the way. So you're right. If it were phrased that way, it would be a hypothetical imperative. But so the idea is that it's categorical. It says, will that which can be universalized, or, don't treat others as a means. I think that's closer to your version about imposition on will or whatever. Or treat people in such a way that they are in a kingdom of ends, so it's sort of everyone's equally important and all that kind of stuff. Now, he's not saying why should I care about that, but the idea is, how do I make sense of myself as a choosing rational agent who's committed to doing certain things? There, he thinks you need to invoke the idea of God. And you're right. I think that's an extra thing, that we can make sense of ourselves in this way without doing that. But it doesn't turn the categorical imperative into a hypothetical imperative, because this is something that just regulates. It's outside the system. It's not part of the system itself.
What is outside the system in your model? What is it? It's just
it's external to the moral considerations.
What is the
postulation of a punisher?
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
Justice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never thought about it that way before. I always said, he's like Descartes, just importing the God in there. But yeah, I can kind of see how your interpretation makes a lot more sense of that. That's really interesting.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I hate to cut this off because we're having such a great discussion. I mean, maybe someday if you can stand me to come back, I'd love to come back and talk to you some more. But
absolutely.
I do get the sense that I'm neglecting my fatherly duties. That's why I take off.
Absolutely. It was great having you on. I really enjoyed your conversation. Go enjoy your games with your son. Let him play The Last of Us 2. That'll be fun.
Yeah, right. No. On that shit, I'm like, get the fuck back in your room, dude. Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. But I just want to say, Tom, I really do. I thank you for having me, but I really do appreciate what you do. Sometimes I think that we need people like you who are smart, quick on their feet, and not just willing to sort of just to hold a mirror up to the arguments which are presented from the theists, because they can just be reflected right back. Oh, God's nature. Oh, fucking physical's nature. Like, I think that strategy is missing in the debates, has been missing. So it's good that you're doing it. I think you're doing great work, and I admire your work. And yeah, anyway, I respect what you do, man.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. It was really, really great hearing that. Again, really great having you on. I will let you get off. I have to go to the bathroom, and
Okay.
have a good day.
All right, later, man.